Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The scent of gunpowder and rust overwhelmed my airway as my mother fell over the top of my crib. My lungs screamed with terror as the doll in my crib recocked the gun. This time, my dream self was able to do something about it. All I could hear through my screams was the internal voice of Uma Thurman. Wiggle your big toe. That's just what I did, inching the maniacal entity towards me and away from my mother, now slouched and bleeding on the floor. It may have been an absolute asshole, but I was still at least 5 to 10 times its size. As terrified as I was, I attempted to wrench the gun from her nubby hands. After holding it so tightly, it let the gun go too damn fast. A burst exploded in my ears, and the smell of gunpowder refreshed itself, as if on an air freshener timer. The color of crimson bloomed through my shirt in a perfect circle as pain consumed my chest. Then I woke up. Society, psychology, and even grade school teachers dictate that we shouldn't play favorites. I mean, sure, inanimate objects are fine. Songs, TV shows, ice cream flavors, etc. But it's common knowledge that it's not nice to have favorite parents, grandparents, children especially, and so on. If someone has a favorite, that could leave open to interpretation to mean everyone else isn't good enough. However, as we know, it's all bullshit. Everyone has a favorite person, and I was my mother's. I don't mean that she loved me more than other children. That went without saying. The point I'm trying to make is that she preferred me over everyone, more than lovers, mentors, family members, etc. Sadly, I resented her for it. While she wanted to recreate our own little version of Grey Gardens, I wanted a life for myself. After all, that was the natural order of things. Women have children and raise them to have families of their own someday. Something that seemed worse than a death sentence to my mother, Livy. I'm sure in the back of her mind she wanted happiness for me. She wasn't a bad mother, after all. I think losing my dad really got to her. From what I was told, she was 6 months pregnant with little old me when she opened the door to 2 solemn-looking deputies one day. She said the pit of dread she felt reached all the way inside the pit of her soul when she saw them. They confirmed her worst fear. My father had been found dead. Police explained what had happened, but my mother was in such shock that it took her days to understand it. My dad was on a job to repossess a vehicle when he ran into a man at the end of his rope. The man pleaded with my father for just 3 more days with the vehicle, to no avail. It turned out the man was at the end of a 2-day run with the law. He fled the scene of a hit and run in the very car my father was supposed to repossess. I guess he hadn't had time to properly clean it to destroy the evidence. The man had been fighting with whether or not to turn himself in the entire night before, and my father's presence was the final sign. In the inevitability of the situation, the man became desperate and pulled a gun. My mom didn't know if the shot was intentional or just the result of jittery hands from adrenaline. But in the end, the result was the same anyway. And of course, as these things do, I was born almost the spitting image of him. My mother resolved to hold on to the only living piece of him she had left, and that was that. Some of my fondest childhood memories were the picnics she used to take us on. She used to sit on the ground with me, leaning over me to smother me with tickles so light they felt like drizzles of rain. Her hair would fall around me, consuming me in the scent of honeysuckle and strawberry. My mother was my perfumed superhero. Normal children had stuffed animals or blankets to bring them comfort, but for me, my mother's scent was home. Years of formative childhood flew by before I realized that my mommy was different from other mommies. All of my friends' mothers' smiles reached their eyes, while mine didn't. She became rigid, with visible discomfort when I played with other children. I don't mean that she was a helicopter mom. I mean that she got this look on her face like she'd stepped on a banana peel stuffed with cat shit or something. She'd never let me attend sleepovers or hold them at the house. Not only that, she would cry about not wanting to be alone when I asked her to go to simple things, like birthday parties, even if they were in the most public of places. It wasn't long before I realized that though she loved me, she was more afraid of being alone than she was of my safety. I didn't judge her for it. From what it sounded like, she had a hard life before I came along. My mother was an enigma to most, a nightmare to some, and a joy to me. As far as nightmares go, though, there was no one she hated more than Bobby Harlow. She didn't waste a single opportunity to let him know that either. We met in community college, the one thing my mother couldn't manage to keep me from. I'd managed to work pretty much everything out as far as my mother went, until he went and fell in love. He asked her for my hand in marriage, hoping to impress me. I wish to God he hadn't. I mean, yeah, the sentiment isn't lost on me, but who the hell does that? This entire, and I mean entire, situation likely could have been avoided if we just said fuck everything and married like everyone else did. God damn it, I wanted to hit him when I found out what he had done. You can imagine my mother's surprise. She hadn't even known I'd been dating anyone. Not only did she tell him no, she also threatened him, completely false, of statutory rape due to him being 2 grades ahead of me. If she did call the police, they'd probably laugh in her face. Still, though, it's not the type of thing to say lightly. Bobby certainly didn't appreciate being called a rapist just for wanting to get married. So, we did what we should have done in the first place, with the damage already done in spades. I moved out, leaving my mother alone and heartbroken. Things went well enough until the sexual frenzied phase wore off. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I said or did something, and Bobby just up and left that day. He said whatever I had done was something identical to my mother. He said that thoughts haunted him all day long about our future together as an older couple, and me just pecking him apart like a crow to a rotting eyeball. I didn't hear much from him after that, until eventually all contact fell away completely. I was left alone, with too much shame and embarrassment to go back home to the mother that needed me. Days turned into weeks that turned into months. When I woke up at 8:13 that fateful Wednesday morning, I knew something was wrong. The house was eerily silent, robbing all sound of its innocuous safety. My body was swathed in a sticky, cold sweat, and I was surprised to find my heart hammering wildly. I hadn't awoken from a night terror, not that I recalled anyway. My muscles ached to spring into unknown motion for an event I wasn't yet aware of. It wasn't much of a shock at first when my phone rang. My mother's nurse Janet's voice drifted solemnly through the line. I found myself responding politely, as if on a business call, completely emotionless. The gravity didn't hit me until a moment or so after the line disconnected. I sank to my knees with heartbreak, allowing myself to succumb to the feelings. I hadn't thought about my mother dying much, and I certainly wasn't ready to accept it. After all, she was always larger than life to me. I always thought I would have more time. I fantasized about long overdue conversations and apologies that now I'd never get to experience. Grief and nostalgia brought out the brightest colors of our happiest memories, leaving the dysfunction to fall away to shadows in the forgotten night. I suppose that's the way it goes sometimes, though. It's the same reason women give birth more than once. You take the beauty out of the experience to forget the pain. Janet had come to the house at 7:30 to make my mother breakfast and administer her medication as she had for the last 8 months. My mother would normally already be awake and in her lifting recliner by the time she walked in, except for that day. That day, Janet opened the door to a dark and silent house. My mother didn't have any pets. She never really had, now that I think about it. I think it's something to do with the inevitability of her having to outlive them. She always demanded control over when people departed her life. Imagine the irony in that. But she noticed an odd smell. She thinks my mother died on her way back into the bedroom from using the bathroom at night. That's when the dreams started. It's only natural, right? I sure as shit had unresolved issues left over from childhood, along with 89% of the rest of the world. My hormones have been completely unbalanced, so that adds another factor. Finally, my mother just died. Whether we had a great relationship or not, the death of a matriarch causes some type of feeling. The oceans that were once our family had changed, sending ripples off in unknown paths with new patterns. I would be small and frozen, utterly paralyzed with fear contained behind bars. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that I was in a baby's crib. My subconscious mind has shrunken me back to my younger days, stuck me somewhere between infancy and toddlerhood, and I felt absolutely everything. The dreams were always more realistic than things that happened in my waking life. Colors, textures, smells, it was all accessible to me. Eventually, I was even able to recognize the room I was in as the one we lived in when I was a young child. The pink and white cloud wallpaper became covered in blood spatter as I watched the first shot tear clean through the side of my mother's face. Her body slumped over the side of the railing, over top of me immediately after, and remained locked in place like a defeated Afghan draped over the back of an old chair. Sputters and gags erupted through my tiny lips as tendrils of the dark hair I once was so in love with trailed down my throat. Frustration thrummed through my being as my brain sent orders that my body wasn't able to accommodate yet. My mother, the only caretaker I'd known, was in danger, and I was rendered powerless to stop it. And that bit you read earlier, that was no mistake. The attacker in my dream was a sentient doll. You know, the type that's heavily lashed eyes close when you tilt their heads back, only it was fully functional. Each plastic digit moved separately on inner command. It had a trifecta of curls painted below its hairline that bared a striking resemblance to 3 6s, as cliche as that sounds. It's not that I was afraid of them, mind you. Everyone has mortal fears and silly ones. For example, it's much more reasonable to be scared of drowning in the ocean than it is to fear, say, frogs. Even the most mature mind holds the silliest of fears. My best friend Melody was always afraid of dolls and clowns. Now, being scared of clowns has become a valid fear, thanks to Mr. Gacy and the clown trends that came in the 2000s. But besides being visually unsettling to some, dolls can't really hurt you. Also, I'd always wake up in a different place than where I'd fallen asleep. Whatever the reason, it all seemed to act as some kind of warning, a foreboding to something that was just out of my conscious grasp. But what? I'd never had recurring dreams before, especially not one so vivid. Like I said before, my mental conditions were ripe for it, I guess. Still though, each time the dream occurred, a new piece of it would unfold. I'd been provided another puzzle piece of my subconscious in each subsequent dream. I found myself spending my waking moments disturbed, dreading what would be revealed next. Did I carry guilt for leaving her behind? Was that what all this was about? These types of questions plagued me all the way through her funeral. I held a stoic stance as they delivered the eulogy. It was odd to hear the pastor speak so much about my mother when he hardly knew her. Everyone's their best selves at church. My resolve was solemn but strong. That is, until they closed the casket lid. A sliver of her face remained visible from my vantage point just before the wooden tomb sealed around her. My stomach was seized with panic, and I found my heart rate increasing faster than I had time to process. Tingles invaded my sinuses seconds before I felt the tears come, and then I fell apart. Normally, I would have been embarrassed. I hate drawing attention to myself. But hell, I was her only living relative. It would look terribly out of place if I didn't cry. People gave sympathetic stares and murmured platitudes for healing, but I couldn't hear them. A kind-faced woman I didn't recognize swept me up in a one-armed hug. The gesture took me almost completely off guard. I was almost sure I'd never met her before in my life. Her other arm was at her side, holding the hand of a little girl, which, judging by her features, was undoubtedly her daughter. I backed away, after allowing myself an appropriate amount of solace in a stranger's comfort, and wiped my eyes dry as I gave the child a smile. I couldn't help but notice she'd brought a baby doll, even dressed it in black for Christ's sake. And guess which kind of doll it was. Go ahead, I'll wait. That's right. One of those rosy-cheeked fuckers with the movable eyelids. Only it seemed to be broken. The eyes moved completely separate from one another. As stupid as it sounded, the thing seemed to be winking at me, like it knew all about the night terrors and what they meant. Completely unhinged by the entire situation, my body began to shake. I sunk to my knees and clamped my hands over my ears as a scream of terror rang through the air. It was so loud that it hurt my own lungs. I didn't realize that I was the one screaming until everyone was staring at me. I shouldn't have done it. I know I shouldn't have done it. But I did. I ran to that darling little girl, grabbed her doll, and threw it into the open grave. A thud rang through the atmosphere as its plastic body hit the wooden lid. My feet raced around to the other side of the burial plot before her mother could stop me and began throwing handfuls of dirt and mud on top of the casket. My hands flew voraciously with hand after handful of dirt, determined to bury the damn doll where it lay. Eventually, 2 sets of hands were brave enough to grab me from behind and drag me away from the ceremony, where I collapsed gratefully in a fresh fit of tears. I spotted the little girl and her mother a ways off in the cemetery, and my heart sank with guilt as I watched the little girl cry hysterically. Her mother shot daggers at me as she ran her hand back and forth over her daughter's back in an effort to soothe her. I looked to the man on my right as I reached into the pocketbook inside of my purse and pulled out some cash. My fingers smudged brown along the crisp green paper as I handed it to the gentleman. "Please," I pleaded softly. "Give this to the girl's mother with my deepest apologies. I'm not well, and probably gave that little child a lifelong fear of funerals and graveyards." He nodded sympathetically as he agreed to my grief-laden request. I stayed just long enough to make sure he approached her, then spun on my heel and left. I was done with crying. Done with all the people, done with the outdoors, done with all of it. The small of my back ached as I straightened up to assess the total clusterfuck that had once been my mother's clean living room. It was littered with things left behind from a woman who was the queen of sentimental hoarding. She could be eating out and see a pretty bird in the sky and keep a napkin from the damn place for the next 20 years. I'd almost filled an entire garbage bag with utter and complete bullshit when I heard the whimpers drift down from upstairs. A cold sweat of dread broke out across my neck and shoulders as I carefully ascended the stairs. This wasn't supposed to be happening, I thought in terror. Not now, at least. I froze in the doorway, keeping careful not to be seen while peering inside. I knew if I made my presence known and achieved eye contact, it was all over. The sounds grew louder as my stomach filled with the acid of anxiety. Nevertheless, I took a deep breath, thrust open the door to my mother's spare bedroom, and plastered the largest fake smile on my face imaginable. There she was, limbs jerking wildly as she struggled to figure out the complexities of her motor skills. "Hello there," I cooed. "Did you have a good nap, baby?" I picked up my daughter Chloe tenderly, lamenting at how much heavier she was getting every day. "Pretty soon, you won't be my little baby anymore," I thought sadly. Yep, that's right. I had a baby. I'd found myself in almost the exact same situation as my mother. Only Chloe's father was alive and well. He was driven away by enough hatred for Mom that even the love and promise of new life wasn't enough for him to stay. And co-parenting would only increase the exposure to my mother's insults, along with sealing the inevitability that he basically married her incarnate. That's why I thought I was moving rooms in my sleep. At first, I thought it was an unspoken maternal instinct. Maybe I walked in my sleep to be closer to Chloe. We had only been in this new space for a short time, and our rooms were vastly far apart from each other. I'm ashamed to admit, especially now, that I hadn't exactly told my mother very much about the baby. In some way, I'm sure she knew all about her, though. We lived in an incredibly small town, not far from where she lived. In hindsight, I should have just let her have her way. It's not as if Bobby stuck around, not that I could blame him. And if that experience taught me anything, it was that I did not need to be in a relationship. Another man was the last thing I wanted. Nope, Chloe had undoubtedly become my favorite person, just like I was my mother's. Even though I knew I wouldn't be all that she needed, she was certainly enough for me. But yeah, I should have just moved back in with Mom and we could have all formed a mother-daughter cult. Then everyone would be alive and happy, right? Please, God, somebody tell me I'm right. It suddenly occurred to me that maybe the dream signified something else entirely. Perhaps my own feelings of inadequacy as a new parent were bleeding into my REM sleep like liquid into a paper towel. The following morning, I awoke with a start, followed by an intense pain in the side of my neck and shoulder. It took me a few seconds to absorb the familiar surroundings. The pink carpeting slid between my fingers as I rolled onto my side. I had already dreaded the pain I knew would accompany my rise to my feet, but I guessed it was inevitable. I slapped at my forehead, surprised by a slight tickle an unwelcome bead of liquid caused as it rolled into my eyes. My vision was overwhelmed with patches of crimson as I struggled to wipe the mess away. Torrents of tears invaded my already wet eyes as I followed the trail of red across the floor to the corner of the room. The once white bars of Chloe's crib were marred with red smears. Those 8 steps across her room seemed to take an eternity. I began to choke on my sobs, unable to keep an even breathing rhythm through horror-robbed lungs. Gobs of spit flew from my lips as I started to scream. You see, in my dream that night, I had finally turned a corner. I was able to not only overcome my terrified paralysis, but beat the doll. I ripped it limb from limb with maniacal glee as the pops of an arm being ripped from its socket. I stared into the crib, expecting to see a jumbled mass of plastic. However, that's not what I saw at all. There was so much blood present that I could barely tell what was what. My mother always wanted to be the only person in my life, ever since before I was born. It seemed that she was sure to get her way. It was supposed to be a dream, the conclusion to a series of terrifying nightmares manifested by unresolved feelings about my mother's death. Only the dream wasn't really a dream. And the doll wasn't really a doll.
My name is George Hart, and I'm a true native New Yorker, born and raised in the great Empire State. My mother, Maria, gave birth to me right here in the Bronx, over at the Lincoln Medical Center. I was told it was during a record cold spell on a frigid February morning back in '38. I grew up in the South Bronx in one of those old 5-story apartment buildings right off Lafayette Avenue. One of those decrepit-looking brick-faced apartment buildings that are practically erected right on top of each other, like the ones on television, where the guys are running from building to building on the rooftops and leaping off to the next roof in a single bound. I always hated having all those buildings built so close to each other, so close that the residents could run a clothesline from their window to the building next door, cramming as much living space as possible into that one block. Yet, here I am again. My mother recently passed away 2 months after my 43rd birthday. I got the call up at work. I was working at a buddy's garage up in Yonkers at the time. The police told me it looked as if she had had a heart attack, died in her sleep. Never knew Mom as having a bad ticker, but shit happens, as they say. After the funeral, I decided to head back to the Bronx from Yonkers and move into our old apartment. The rent was a lot cheaper, and Raymond, whose garage I was working at, had made a phone call and gotten me a job at a garage that was only a few blocks away from the old place near Randall Avenue. The Lord taketh away, and he giveth. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of 5 and faced the street out front. I left most of the things in the apartment the way they were when I moved back in. Even left Mom's room the way it was. I felt bad just at the thought of getting rid of any of her stuff, so I left her room be. I wound up settling into my old bedroom. The bed seemed to have shrunk considerably since I was in it last, my feet hanging just over the edge of the mattress. Once I saved up a few bucks, I'd have to look into replacing the bed. I made a mental note to myself of making that one of my first priorities. It took me until the beginning of May before I was finally feeling settled in at both the old apartment and the new job. I even made the acquaintance of a couple of my neighbors in the building. There was an old black couple up on the 5th floor, Horace and Sophia Coogan. They were somewhere in their late 60s, real nice people. They had been living here for the longest time. When I mentioned to them that I was Maria's son, they said they remembered me as a small boy, even though I had no recollection of them. Either way, good people. Then there was a Puerto Rican girl on the floor below me, Lucinda Estevez. I never asked how old she was, as that's just something you never ask a woman, so I'd have to just guesstimate that she was somewhere in her late 30s. Beautiful woman, with olive-colored skin and long black hair and big dark eyes. I had run into her several times prior as we were getting mail from my mailboxes downstairs before I finally got up the nerve to start up a conversation. She lived alone and had moved in just over a year before me. As May was sliding by and summer was getting ready to make its scorching grand entrance into the ghettos of the Bronx, Horace asked me one day if I wouldn't mind looking at their car. He could only describe the problem with their old blue Pinto as not running right. I felt obligated as a neighbor and a mechanic to take a gander beneath the hood and see what was cooking. It was during that overcast Saturday afternoon when I went out to the street with my toolbox that I first became aware of the Nightcrawler. Old Horace must have felt a little guilty having me out there at the curb looking under the hood by myself. Or maybe Sophia had coaxed him out there to keep me company as I gave the engine a going over. He stood leaning against the car with his hands crammed in his pockets, gazing up at the neighboring apartment buildings that lined our street.
Gonna be a hot summer,
he stated to no one in particular as his eyes scanned the facades of the surrounding buildings.
Uh-huh. Nightcrawler gonna have a grand old time this year.
To who? I asked from under the hood as I was checking the spark plug tips.
The Nightcrawler,
he repeated nonchalantly.
Your mama never told you about her?
I can't say she ever did. Who is she? Some homeless lady? Horace chuckled at my inquiry.
No, I wish that was all she was. She come out every summer hoping to find some poor soul with the windows wide open on a hot summer night.
His statement had drawn my curiosity, and I emerged from under the hood while still running a folded piece of sandpaper between a plug's electrode and arm. What? Horace turned his eyes from the urban landscape and faced me.
Some folk think it's just some silly urban legend, but I seen it with my own 2 eyes, so I know better. You'll find none of my windows open at night during the summer. No, sir, and I'd advise you to do the same.
I was the one chuckling now. What are you talking about? He leaned closer and lowered his tone slightly as a woman and her 3 kids passed us on the sidewalk.
They say there's an old Haitian woman who lives here in the Bronx. Exactly where I don't know, nor do I want to. Come over on a boat a long time ago. They say she's a mambo.
Mambo? I now found myself leaning on the car next to him. The engine was a distant memory.
A voodoo priestess. They say she's older than you, me, and Sophia all put together. She's still alive after all this time because of that Nightcrawler. She sent it out on a summer night to suck the life out of people while they sleep. Then it crawls back to her before the sun rises and breathes the life of those folks into her. That will keep her alive for so long.
I found the yarn that Horace was spinning as entertaining as it was captivating, and went along with his fabricated story. So exactly what is this, Nightcrawler?
Well, to be honest, the Nightcrawler is what I call it. Its true name is Le Rodieu.
Le Ro... I struggled to repeat the foreign word.
Le Rodieu. It's a French word. Means something that creeps or prowls around, or something of the sort. Shit, I'm not French. That's why I call it the Nightcrawler. Anyway, this thing looks something like a big black spider, but it's not really a spider exactly. It has part of a woman mixed in there. Something that priestess called up from some hole in hell.
A spider? Mixed with a woman? His imagination was without limits.
Only way I can describe it. I didn't believe in all that bullshit voodoo mumbo-jumbo either, till I saw it myself. It was about 5 or 6 summers ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to take a piss. When you get old, you find yourself always having to piss. Anyway, as most folks do here in the summer who can't afford an air conditioner or the electric bill that come with it, they leave the windows wide open all night, hoping that some kind of breeze blows in during the night to offer a little relief from the heat while they're sleeping.
I nodded as I listened. I recalled how my mother had always kept the windows wide open at night during the summer, even with one of those small isolating fans going all night long. I remember just lying there in the dark, spread eagle on the sheets, and nothing but my skivvies trying to cool off from the stifling heat.
Well, I was standing there in front of the John pissing and looking out the small window above it. At first I thought I was seeing things, but after rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I found out I wasn't. I saw this giant spider crawling on the building across the way. It blended in with the night shadows and was as silent as the grave as it moved. I watched it scurry about along the side of the wall, checking each window it came upon. When it stopped at an open one, it crawled right into that apartment. Not sure how long I stood there at the John watching out the window, but it was sometime long after I'd finished pissing when it came back out and crawled off to the back of the building. Later the next day, come to find out that Mr. Jackson was found dead in that apartment.
I realized just how distracting this story had become and moved back to the engine. I didn't want to spend all afternoon under the hood on my Saturday. That was probably just a coincidence. Like you said, it was dark and there were shadows, and you had just awakened. A perfect combination to be seeing hallucinations.
Hallucinations, my dick. I know what I saw. The thing was like some spider woman crawling about the sides of the buildings at night looking for an open window, so it can creep in and suck the life out of someone in their sleep. If you're smart, you'll take my—
Horace!
Sophia was calling down from their window 5 floors up.
Come on up for lunch. Got soup and a sandwich waiting for you.
Just keep your windows closed at night, George. At least until summer passes.
With his parting words, Horace pulled himself from off the car and patted my shoulder as he shuffled into the building. As I was checking and cleaning the other spark plugs, I found myself still smiling at his urban legend and how seriously he took it. I thought about how hot their apartment must get in the summer at night, with only a small fan going and all the windows sealed because of one old superstitious man. I laughed out loud and shook my head as I continued with my task. Just like Horace had predicted that Saturday afternoon, summer had come early with a blazing introduction. The sweltering humidity seemed to linger all day, making the simple act of breathing a laborious effort, and still it mocked and defied you as it remained even in the dark of night. During the past couple of weeks I had become closer with Lucinda, and we saw more of one another other than outside of just bumping into each other at the mailbox. On a couple of occasions, we even went out to a local bar down the street for a couple of beers. In that time, we had become comfortable enough with each other to exchange apartment keys. Not that there was nothing serious going on between us, but we just trusted one another enough to hold on to each other's key just in case we got locked out. It was easier this way instead of waking up the building super late at night just to tell him you were locked out. It had been just over a month after we exchanged keys when it happened. I had come home late one Friday night from the garage, and the heat of that day just seemed to drain the strength from me. You know the feeling. All I wanted to do when I walked in that door was flop on the couch and knock back a few cold beers and watch some television. I eventually wound up calling Lucinda to see if she wanted to hang out and share a few drinks. Maybe even go down to the bar where there was air conditioning. But there was no answer at her place. Probably out on a date or with some friends. I decided to make the best of the evening and settled for some cold cores and back-to-back episodes of The Honeymooners. I couldn't tell you what time I had fallen asleep. One minute I was 5 beers in, watching Ralph and Norton preparing to buy a hot dog stand, and the next I was sound asleep. Something, though, had awakened me from my clammy slumber sometime past midnight. I slowly opened my eyes and saw that there was nothing on the television now but static. The network was done for the night, and the apartment was dark. As I laid there on the couch with my clothes sticking to me with sweat, I debated if I should jump in the shower and try to cool off before I went to my bed for the rest of the night. Before I could come to any conclusion on the matter, the noise that had initially awakened me came again. A creaking of a floorboard. It came from the kitchen behind the couch. Now, I had grown up in this apartment and knew it as well as one might an old close friend. I knew which windows leaked cold drafts in the winter, which wall sockets worked and which didn't, and especially what areas of the hardwood floor creaked when stepped upon. I gently closed my eyes and feigned sleep as I awaited my next move. The floor creaked again ever so slightly as pressure was placed on its surface. Someone had somehow managed to get into my apartment. I racked my brain for anything close at hand that I could use as a weapon. I strained on picturing a mental image of my surrounding area on the couch, and I couldn't find nothing that would aid me in a fight. Empty beer cans and a TV remote weren't cutting the mustard. I thought if I were to perhaps suddenly fly off the couch screaming like some madman that it would give me the element of surprise and maybe even the upper hand. But that notion was swept aside when I now felt a weight being applied to the couch itself. Was somebody climbing onto the couch with me? I slowly allowed my eyelids to part, as I could no longer cluelessly lay there oblivious to what was taking place. I damn near screamed and pissed myself. Though my eyes were beholding what was squatting over me, my mind was mentally screaming that this could not be reality, but a horrifying nightmare that I could not awaken from. The ghastly monstrosity was directly over me, balanced partially on both the couch and the floor. I instantly recognized it as some giant man-sized spider. 4 of its long segmented legs were perched on the back of the couch while the other 4 rested on the floor between the TV and I. The foul creature was huge and black with splashes of gray mixed into its body, giving it superb camouflage for its nighttime patrols amongst the shadows. The most hideous aspect of this abomination was its head. Horace was indeed correct about it being a female. A human head was fixed where the spider's face should have been. A haggard-looking gray face of a woman with long, matted black hair that dangled about my face. The eyes in the ungodly face were a milky white, all 4 of them. 2 more smaller eyes bulged from the forehead. The misshapen mouth was even more grotesque. 2 small infant-like arms stretched from the sides of its neck and constantly moved about, its tiny pointed fingers grasping at the air and its little hands playfully touching the creature's dripping maw. As I had said, I did not scream. I couldn't, but I sure as hell pissed myself though. I was literally paralyzed with fear as I lay there in sweat and urine. The face loomed closer, and the spider's sternum lowered itself onto me, and I could now feel its weight. The tiny hands reached out and began to gently stroke my face as it was lining its mouth directly onto mine. I was about to have the life sucked out of me, and they would find me sprawled out dead on the couch in the morning, just like that Mr. Jackson fellow.
George?
Someone was calling my name outside my door and began knocking louder than one should.
George, you up? I forgot my key.
My God, not her. Please don't let it take her. I mentally cried as the sudden noise startled it, causing it to lift itself off me. The head turned towards the door as Lucinda called my name again and knocked.
I'm gonna come in and get my key, okay? I hope you're decent.
I could hear her fumbling my spare key into the door's lock. The face turned back to meet mine, and the little hands again caressed my face. Soon. It spoke in a gurgled hiss, and in one quick movement it was off both me and the couch. As the front door swung open, I heard it brush against the kitchen window frame on its way out, rattling the glass pane as it passed through. Even as Lucinda walked in and saw me lying on the couch surrounded by beer cans and in my piss-stained pants, I still couldn't move. What I had just experienced was so surreal that my mind was still trying to sort through what had just happened when she looked down at me in disgust.
Jesus Christ, George, what the fuck? Look at yourself,
was all she said as she walked over to the wall and pulled her key off the nail it hung from. She looked down at me again, shook her head in disappointment, and scoffed before she walked out. Still, I just laid there in a hot mess and in silence. I could only imagine the sight I must have been. It took me a good 10 minutes to process everything that had occurred and chalked it up to something that was dreadfully real and not some baneful dream. When I finally accepted the ordeal as pure fact, I recalled the one word that thing spoke before it scurried back out the window. Soon. It was then I leapt from the couch and began closing and securing all the windows to the apartment, as well as closing all the shades. As the reality of my experience soaked in, my legs and hands began to shake. I reached into the cabinet above the sink and pulled out a bottle of the hard stuff. I must confess that I had never been so scared in all my life, and I turned on every light in the apartment, then sat at that kitchen table all night, pulling off that bottle until the sun rose. Only then did I move to my bedroom and succumb to a restless sleep. I awoke the next morning with the notion that last night's events were in no way accurate and just a far-off dream. The idea was almost accepted until I sat up, still in yesterday's clothes, and saw the front of my pants were still damp with piss. With it being daylight and the temperature already rising, I pulled myself from my bed and showered. The whole time I stood under the cool cascade of water, I tried to tell myself that it couldn't have been real. After changing into some fresh clothes, I finished what was left of the bottle and went up to see Horace. To my luck, Sophia had run out to do some food shopping, leaving Horace and myself alone for the time being. Before I could unload my experience onto him, he poured us each a shot of blackberry brandy. He said that by the look on my face, I needed it. It was after the third shot that I told him of last night's encounter. There were times where I stammered through my story, and at one point almost cried, but with much difficulty and 2 more shots of brandy, I finally concluded my tale.
Sound to me like that young girl saved your ass last night.
He finally said.
It also sounds like the Nightcrawler isn't through with you yet.
What do you mean?
If that thing told you soon, what you think that means, huh? Sound to me like she's gonna be paying you another visit.
But why? I was already starting to sweat despite the old box fan that was mounted in the window, which was failing to blow any cool air into the room.
You denied it a life, and you got a pretty good look at it, I guess. Only thing I can tell you, George, is you was one lucky motherfucker. And you owe that girl downstairs, even though she has no idea what she did.
Yeah, I guess I do. I stood up and set the shot glass on an end table near my chair. I've got to get going, Horace. I'm still having a hard time swallowing all this. I need to do some thinking.
You do all the thinking you need to. And most of all, make sure your windows are locked up every night now.
He also stood and walked me to the door. Every summer night since then, I closed and secured all the windows religiously. I didn't give a damn how hot it got in that tiny apartment. Those windows stayed shut. It took me the rest of that summer before I stopped closing my blinds at night. Eventually, my life began to slowly resume its normal day-to-day activities, and I started talking to Lucinda again. You see, after that night, she avoided me and had even given me back the key to my place. She must have thought I was some drunken vagrant after what she saw that night. I never mentioned what really happened, and never will. After that day up in Horace's apartment, I never spoke a word of it again, and Horace never brought up the subject. Sometimes over the last few summers, while I laid there in bed on those sweltering nights, laying spread-eagled in my skivvies just as I had done as a child, I would catch a glimpse of some dark shadow moving quietly past one of my windows. I didn't try to summon up some reasonable explanation to the shape or begin to deny what was really out there crawling around, because I knew exactly what it was. Le Rodier, the Nightcrawler. During its late-night prowling about the city, it was occasionally making a detour just to see if I had let down my guard and accidentally left a window open. Last summer, Horace passed away. No, not by the Nightcrawler. He still kept his windows closed every summer like clockwork. He had tripped carrying a bag of groceries up the steep stairs to his apartment. The poor bastard broke his neck in the fall. Killed him instantly, some say. I was at work when it occurred and found out from Lucinda later that day as we met at our mailboxes. A month later, Sophia moved away and was staying with family down in North Carolina. As for Lucinda, we gradually started hanging out once more and even exchanged keys again. The Lord taketh away, and he giveth. Things were finally starting to fall back into a comfortable state of normality. I even spent some money I had stashed away for a new couch and bought an air conditioner for Lucinda. I never forgot what Horace had said about me owing that girl for her unexpected arrival that night and saving my ass from a horrible death. The least I could do was give her a reason to close her windows in summer. I think my gift won me major brownie points because we're going out next weekend for dinner. This relationship may just be ready to progress to the next level. I was coming home from that bar down the street where Lucinda and I used to frequent, only this time I was out celebrating one of my co-workers' birthdays. All the guys from the garage were there. Despite the day's earlier heat, there was a slight breeze in the air that night, and it felt good as I walked home. The pleasantry was short-lived, though, as I entered my building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. I was sweating like a whore in church by the time I reached my door. As soon as I walked in and closed the door behind me, I could tell she had been in my apartment. Her perfume still lingered in the air as I walked into the darkened confines inside. The only light on was the overhead light above the stove. A folded piece of paper was neatly placed on the stove's surface. My name was written across it. I was already smiling as I unfolded the paper and read the handwritten note. George, I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate the air conditioner and how much I appreciate you. We've really come a long way since you first moved in. To show you how much I appreciate your efforts, I bought a bottle of wine and will probably have started it by the time you read this. How about coming downstairs and helping me finish it? Lucinda. P.S. I opened a few of the windows to let some air in. There's a beautiful breeze out tonight. How you can have them closed all summer is beyond me. My smile faded as quickly as it had formed, and the letter slipped from my fingers. I could only stare straight ahead as I heard something shifting in the room's darkness. It pushed aside a chair behind me as it was moving closer. A black shadow began to fall over me. I closed my eyes as tightly as possible. Finally, the gurgled hiss spat into my ear. This time, I did scream.
something sure does smell good. I walked behind my wife, Kristen, and kissed her on the neck as the smell of fat and nitrates enticingly danced into my nostrils.
Thought you might like a nice breakfast this morning.
Kristen took a sip of coffee and smiled. She still looked the same as when we lived together in college 13 years ago. Maybe it was the oversized sweater she wore, or maybe it was because her blonde hair still shimmered like a morning sun. But ever since my first dive into her gray-blue eyes, she's been my world. You thought correct. I began to pile a plate with enough bacon to build my own Frankenstein pig.
Toast?
Kristen asked as she ran her fingers through my thick brown forest of curls. Not even waiting for an answer, she popped 2 slices of rye bread into the toaster. Flipping 2 over-medium eggs onto my plate, I chuckled.
Hey.
Her face flushed like a ripening tomato. No, nothing. I began to chew on a strip of bacon. Why do I feel like I'm being courted?
Maybe because you are?
Well, you're doing a great job. Kristen sat down in front of me and smiled. This was always her thing. Whenever my lovely wife wanted to tell me something I may not like, I'd always get softened up with a meal. Judging by the amount of bacon she had fried up, it was easy to see that she was going to drop a bomb. The wooden chair groaned when I sat down at the kitchen table. I didn't even have a chance to pepper my egg whites before my wife slid into the seat in front of me.
So,
she started as she handed me a mug of coffee.
2 things.
2? You better whip up some pancakes then. And get the good syrup, not the high-fructose corn garbage. I joked.
I'm going to accept the offer.
Kristen squeaked out before she hid behind her coffee mug. Oh.
And?
She stammered as if she didn't want to finish the sentence. And what?
I'm starting tomorrow.
I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. It felt as though my tongue had doubled in size. Oh, could I think, though? Closing my eyes tight, a young man in a slim-fitting navy suit stood before me. He was muscular, with dark eyes, chestnut brown hair, and a jawline to sharpen a razor. Hello, sir. He stuck out a hand. Then I opened my eyes and remembered that the young man didn't exist anymore. That young man had died long ago. That young man had promised his wife the world, but only delivered a gas station convenience store snow globe. That's so exciting, I was finally able to say. Kristen gave me a sort of half smile.
Well, don't get too excited. Wouldn't want to have the neighbors call the police.
We have no neighbors, I grumbled as I prodded the yolk of an egg with my fork. A pool of yellow filled up the plate, soaking the rest of my breakfast.
I know. It was a joke.
I know what it was. At first, Kristen rolled her eyes, but then they narrowed upon me.
Well, don't you think you could be...
She stood.
I don't know, happy for me?
I am happy for you, and proud of you, Chris. I'm sorry, it's just been frustrating for me. Good to know at least one of us is doing well, right? I tried my hardest to sound enthused. Laugh lines creased on Kristen's face.
Oh my god, thank you. Thank you, Hunter Benson. I'll be making more than I did at my old job, like a lot more.
She paused.
The next go-round, you'll pass the bar, and by that time, I'll have new connections here.
Absolutely. I smiled. I finally realized why my wife looked the same as in college. She didn't look the same. No, that wasn't it. It was because she still saw me as the 22-year-old boy who had the world by the balls. You know, you're right, Chris. We'll be the super couple of law. They'll make a reality show about us.
That's what I'm saying, babe.
She poured herself another cup of coffee.
kind of want to celebrate. I'm going to pour some Irish cream in here.
I know what you're asking yourself. How did this asshole wind up with her? If you were to look up the definition of perfect partner in the dictionary, you'd see a picture of my wife. Anyone would do anything to be with her. And trust me, after being together almost 15 years, I've seen a whole lot of things. After graduating from law school, Kristen and I moved to the big city. My beautiful wife had a job as a junior attorney all lined up for herself in Manhattan. On the other hand, I couldn't even pass the bar exam. Finally, I conceded that city life wasn't for me. It was for Kristen, though. She loved the city that never slept. She's one of those girls that likes shopping on Christmas Eve. And because of me, my saint of a wife left her city and followed me into the dark. We moved to Lake George, where my family owned a run-down vacation home. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. This once rich white kid who spent his entire life in suburbia has now fled to the mountains because he couldn't handle the idea of making his mother and father's school debt worth it. Oh, by the way, my parents paid for my undergrad and law degrees. Seriously, they would have been better flushing their money down the toilet. Maybe Pennywise could have become a doctor.
Then we can, fix this place up. It'll be a great home to raise a family.
She placed her empty mug down and ran her fingers over my chest. Hey, you know what? I stood abruptly. While you're gone during the day, I can start on my own renovations. It's about time I opened the old shed up again. Kristen led me into the living room and sprawled out onto the couch.
Oh yes, that is definitely what you should open.
I awoke before Kristen, who didn't seem to notice the sun's orange beam blaring through the living room window. Finding my shorts, I stretched and made for the back door. The tiny hill that led to the shed was filled with roots, all of which had the same intention of tripping anyone who stepped over them. Luckily, the key to this box of rotten termite scraps was still under the same rock that it had been since the dawn of time. Or at least since my family had come here for a summer vacation. When I got the shed open, a shotgun immediately fell out and onto the ground in front of me. I opened the chamber and saw one shell. The next thing I noticed was an old rowboat. Pulling it out into the open air, I could almost hear laughter as if a lifetime of happy memories were preserved in the boat's wood. After finding an old fishing rod and digging out enough earthworms to fill half a coffee tin, I brought the boat into the lake. I figured I could come back with a couple of fish to fry up, and have another round in the ring with Kristen afterward. I was out on the water for 5 hours. The sky had turned from a hazy orange to a deep bruise purple, and I didn't catch a single fish. Rocking back and forth on the water didn't come close to creating a sense of comfort. No, it boiled a pot of anger. Past the bar, Kristen had no idea that ship had sailed away, like my family after giving me the parting gift of this lake house. Of course I couldn't pass the bar. It was something I had to do on my own. Mommy and Daddy couldn't get me out of this one. What an utter failure I had become. This is the man that the perfect partner is stuck with. Maybe she isn't so perfect after all. I screamed until my throat felt like it was wrapped in sandpaper. And after it grew hoarse, I screamed some more. You would think that watching the sunset would have helped me cool down. Nope, I hated sunsets. I know. What kind of crazy nutjob says he hates sunsets? Well, to most, sunset is one of nature's greatest beauties. To me, it meant another wasted day. And as I thought about that day, I realized that sunrise would only be bringing another day to waste. 3 long months passed. That's 90 days. So to me, that's 90 wasted days. It didn't even seem to faze me anymore. If Kristen wasn't working late for her boss, Ronald Tercy, she was going in early. Morning quickies were replaced with patterned pecks. The conversation became passing grunts fit for a subway terminal. And meals were frozen piles of mystery meat and soggy carrots. Every day, I would tell Kristen that I was studying, or maybe I would fix that leaky faucet, but it was never true. I'd take the test in the winter, fail, and be at the exact same spot I was now. Maybe you could tell me what exactly is the point of it all. My main comfort was now the rowboat. Every day, I would go out onto the water, lay down with my hat over my face, and sleep the day away. Of course, I tried to be productive, but it was pointless. I had never lived for myself. I went to college for my parents, law school for Kristen, and now I had no idea what I wanted. Kristen was the only beacon of hope for me in the endlessly twisting path that was my life. And, well, with her gone for sometimes 3/4 of any given day, I was lost. One night, a cricket song woke me from my stupor. I opened my eyes to a shimmering night. The moon seemed to be smiling down at me as it wrapped the world in a blanket of silver starlight. My watch read 11:47, and I immediately sat up. Rowing with all my might, I made it back to shore, eager to spend a little time with Kristen. She wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. Then I remembered the time and realized she must have gone to bed. Maybe I could wake her for a few quick minutes of fun before I fell back into a sleepless dream again. Our bed was empty. A whirl of thoughts spun around my head before screaming in my face. Did she get in an accident? I ran down the steps to check the driveway, and it too was empty. Oh no! My voice cracked. Oh no! I repeated. Trying to compose myself, I took a deep breath. Let's not jump to conclusions, Hunt, I said. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a cold glass of water. I stumbled into the living room and fell onto the couch, spilling water all over my chest. I took another deep breath and noticed the blinking red light on our answering machine. I was afraid to press play. Can you believe that? My wife, the love of my life, could have been hurt, or worse, and I was afraid to find out, afraid to face any sort of reality. Finally, I mustered up the courage and pressed play. There was a loud scream that made the speaker crackle. It sounded twisted. It sounded possessed. Did it sound drunk? The scream turned into a giddy woo, and I began to laugh.
Hunt, I'm sorry, but...
Kristen's voice was my favorite song, one that I would love to leave on repeat until the end of time.
Get off! Give me that back!
She said to someone. A gruff mumble answered.
Hunt, I'm sorry, but the dinner ran late. Mr. Tercy...
The same voice mumbled again.
Ron, took the team out for drinks afterward. I'll be home close to midnight.
Kristen slurred.
I love you.
Close to midnight, I muttered. Well, that should be now. In case you haven't noticed, I've started to talk to myself quite a lot over the last 3 months. You try being by yourself all day and tell me you don't need someone to talk to. Then, I heard my voice. At least, I think it was my voice. I didn't feel myself speaking the words, but it sounded like me. Well, it sounded like me if I had just finished chain-smoking a pack of cigarettes.
Home late again?
Yeah, that's what she has to do, I answered.
She goes in early and comes home late. Even works weekends.
Right. She's making our dream a reality.
Oh? Your dream?
My dream. My dream is for my wife to be happy.
Your wife who spends no time with you anymore. Even in the city, she worked all day and night. She worked to stay away from you.
That's not true. I laughed nervously.
You know what she's doing. What she's always done.
No. There's no way she would betray me. She loves me.
Odd way to show love, wouldn't you say? She created a dream for you and has ignored you ever since.
So she's...
Probably right now. You heard that voice. A man's voice.
I rewound the answering machine.
Hun, I'm sorry.
I pressed rewind, then pressed play.
Hun, I'm sorry.
The spinning sound of the tape rewinding made my flesh crawl, made my jaw tighten so tight that I thought my teeth would crack out of my gums. But I still kept pressing rewind and play, rewind and play, rewind and fucking play.
Hun, I'm sorry. Hun, I'm sorry. Hun, I'm sorry.
You're right, I rasped.
You've always known.
Of course, she would want another.
Easy choice, right? Rich, powerful, driven, versus you.
Headlights flashed in the driveway at 1:45. I opened the door to greet my wife with a mask of a smile. Waving to the driver, Mr. Tercy, I opened the passenger door to be slapped in the face with the smell of bourbon.
Hunt!
Kristen cried as she wrapped her arms around my neck. Thank you for taking her home, Ron. Ronald Tercy seemed thrown off by my knowledge of his name. He had held a hand out to shake, but didn't say a word. I ignored his gesture and kissed my wife.
So I have a surprise.
Kristen giggled. What's that?
My sister is coming tomorrow.
Oh, well, I'll have to clean up the guest room then. I helped Kristen get out of the car. I watched my wife as she smiled at the man in the sleazy 3-piece suit and brushed past me to go inside. Tell you what, Ron, how about you stay the night? It's not safe to drive on the roads this late.
Yeah, my brother is a sergeant in Schenectady. I'll be just fine.
You can still crash. Your brother's name wouldn't help you there, I whispered. He thought for a moment, then threw the car into park.
You know, you're right. Thanks for your concern, Hunter.
Together, we walked inside without saying a word. Kristen was in the kitchen sipping on a bottle of water.
Oh.
She coughed. Ron is going to stay the night.
That's great.
And I can drive you to get your car in the morning. Tall and dark with broad shoulders, Ronald stuck his chest out proudly, as if he had come up with the idea on his own. Kristen nodded.
Sure.
Chris, I'm going to show your boss the boat. I didn't wait for my wife to respond. Hey, pass us a few cold ones. You up for a nightcap?
You know it.
My wife's boss answered, taking a bottle of beer from her. Walking out into the darkness, I beckoned Ron to pass in front of me. "After you, good sir." Of course, the asshole didn't object. When we passed the shed, I stopped. "Oh, keep going. I'll be right there." I bent down to fiddle with my shoelaces. Slowly, I reached for the shotgun. Grabbing it by the barrel, I stood up and aimed. Trust me, I know it's cowardly to shoot a man in the back, but so is stealing a man's wife.
It'll be too loud.
It doesn't matter. No one will hear.
Kristen won't hear a gunshot?
What was that?
A voice came from the bottom of the hill. Nothing. I tossed the shotgun down to the ground and saw a stone. The same stone that I lifted to find the key to the shed.
Boy, this is paradise,
Ronald Tercy said as he took a sip of beer. As the rowboat began to rock back and forth, he stretched his arms up in the air and placed them behind his head.
Quite the life you got here, Hunt.
I'm sure you've got it good too, I mumbled.
Yeah, but nothing beats this. Tiny house in the lake and a lovely wife is the recipe for happiness.
I furrowed my brow. Are you married?
Divorced.
He took another sip of beer and fixed his sight upon the moon. I fiddled with the stone in my pocket and found a pointed end. Pressing my pointer finger into it, I felt a slight sting of pain.
What are you waiting for?
Come again? When Ronald Tercy sat up, I smashed him in the face with the rock, shattering his mouth into a cave of bloody splinters. For a moment, he tried to lift his hands to fight back, but I swung once again, this time landing my blow on his temple. He fell onto his back, and I leapt on top of him. I punched and stabbed and punched and punched and stabbed until there was nothing left of the man's head except bits of skull, brains, soaked in a pool of blood. I had no idea what to do with the body. Should I bury him?
Burying him would be the more respectful way to dispose of him. You don't want that.
I nodded. Still leaking from the bloody ruin of his face, I tossed the man's lifeless body into my shed, locked it up, and threw the key into the lake. The trail of blood glittered in the silvery moonlight, making everything seem magical. Everything just felt so right. Still painted in blood, I crept up the stairs to my bedroom. Kristen was asleep and was wearing the most beautiful smile.
That's a smile that knows a secret.
I know. I grabbed my pillow and pressed it over her face. This time, I was in control of her life. If I wanted to, I could lift the pillow and let her taste the sweet nectar of air. But we all know that wasn't happening. A knock on the front door woke me. I looked to my right to see Kristen. Her skin was the color of milk, her mouth and eyes open like she had been petrified. I rose and stumbled into the bathroom to splash water on my face. The man in the mirror seemed to glow. This was what a proud man looked like. This was what a successful man looked like. Was I afraid of who was at the door? Was I scared of getting caught? Absolutely not.
Jesus!
Kristen's sister, Wendy, cried when I opened the door. Oh, hey, Wen. Come on in. The sky behind her was just beginning to transform into a swirl of yellow, orange, and red. Wendy stood frozen on the threshold.
What are you? Is that blood?
I looked down and noticed that my body was covered in crusty brown patches of victim number 1's blood. There were probably some brains mixed in there too. Yup, I answered. Went hunting. Let's just say I shouldn't quit my day job and become a butcher.
I'll say. Try a supermarket next time, Rambo.
Wendy smirked.
Here.
She handed me a stack of mail that had been ignored for well over a month.
Kristen here? I didn't see her car.
No, she'll be back soon. Come on in, let me get you a drink. Wendy slipped past me and into the kitchen. I thumbed through credit card offers and fast food menus until I came upon an envelope addressed to Kristen Benson from Ronald Tercy. Ripping it open, 2 tickets fell onto the floor. I tore the rest of the envelope apart and found a note. Kristen, I wanted to give you and your husband a gift to show my appreciation. You always talk about how life was in the big city, so I figured you two could take a few days soaking in the lights of the city that never sleeps. Enclosed are 2 tickets to The Lion King. Please enjoy, and make sure to come to me for a credit card. I do not want you or Hunter spending a dime in the Big Apple. My chest tightened as I picked up the 2 Broadway tickets. See, here is where I should have realized the monster I had become. It would have been appropriate for me to drop to my knees and sob at the mistake I made. Who knows? Maybe even go outside and wrap my lips around the barrel of Daddy's shotgun. Hey, Wen, I said, stepping into the kitchen. Wendy took a swig of beer.
Hey, Hunt.
Let's go out back. The sun's about to set.
American Journal of Russian History, Volume 21, Issue 3. Dead Letters. Imperial Russian Army Correspondence from the Eastern Front in World War I. Written and translated by Oksana Volkov, Ph.D. As soon as Imperial Russia entered World War I, the Provisional Regulations on Military Censorship Law was imposed on soldiers deployed to the front lines. Unfortunately, many letters, some doubtless the last correspondence from a son or husband, never reached loved ones. Such was the case for Mrs. Alexandra Alexiev, the wife of Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev, whom he often addressed as Zaychik, pronounced and written in translation as Zaya, meaning bunny. However, that these letters were intercepted and stored by military censors is a boon for military historians studying the Eastern Front. Overshadowed by the Western Front and the 1917 Communist Revolution, life on the Eastern Front is often overlooked. This is unfortunate given that this front was more dynamic, as trench warfare never developed along the long front line. These letters provide insight into the realities of the battlefield as these soldiers experienced it. The following examples from Staff Captain Alexiev show the transformation from blind patriot to disillusioned combat veteran. They also provide evidence for a truce, similar to 1914's Christmas truce on the Western Front. The so-called Wolf Truce of 1917 was documented in American papers ranging from the Oklahoma City Times to the old gray lady herself, the New York Times. It was reported from St. Petersburg that along the front, near what is today Vilnius, Lithuania, then the Kovno-Wilna-Minsk Governorate, a pack of wolves became so emboldened that they began attacking German and Russian soldiers. Initially seeking the bodies of the dead and wounded, these predators soon began attacking isolated soldiers. Eventually, the two sides stopped fighting each other in order to combat the wolves until the threat was neutralized. Staff Captain Alexiev's letters contain the only mention in the Russian State Military Historical Archives collection of letters from the front. These letters are here presented in their entirety for the first time.
29 June 1914, Prussia. Zaya. I wish I could tell you exactly where I am. However, the censors will not appreciate it, and this letter may never reach those delicate hands I miss so much. My heart swells to bursting that you married me before the Tsar sent us to the front. The pride of you becoming my bride is the only thing that compares to the joy I feel for the coming fight in defense of our motherland and our Tsar. These Prussians will be a worthy adversary, which will make fighting them more glorious. Despite the hardships we know we will face, the atmosphere is jubilant. Estimates of our homecoming range from Christmas to Easter. I have faith in the righteousness of our cause and the ability of the officers appointed over me. The men are conscripted peasants and are rough when it comes to military bearing and discipline. However, I, along with my peers, have faith in our non-commissioned officers to provide examples for these unruly but tough men to follow. Indeed, the sturdy nature of the Russian peasant may prove a secret weapon on the battleground. I love you. Junior Lieutenant Andrei Alexiev. 18 September 1914, Prussia. Zaya. I am sorry I have not written sooner. I am alive and my spirits are buoyed by the letter I received dated 25 August. That was the start of the battle at Tannenberg. I cannot say much that the censors will allow, other than to say that I was wounded enough to have spent the better part of 3 weeks in a hospital, but not so grave that I will be returned to your arms before the war is won. Indeed, I won a promotion due to valor on the battlefield. Our resolve is shaken but not broken. While I believed we would be home by Christmas after meeting the enemy, I must revise my estimate closer to Easter. I love you, Lieutenant Andrei Alexiev. 21 December 1916, Kovno-Wilna Minsk Governorate. Zaya. The war drags on with heroes and evil on both sides of this terrible conflict. Even the animals have abandoned this hellscape. I cannot remember the last time I've seen a creature that had not been conscripted by Earth's greatest monster, man, as we destroy God's creation. I am ashamed of my prior adoration for war. If you have retained the letters from that naive and foolish version of me that no longer exists, I beg of you to burn them. When I return, I do not wish to be reminded of my past zeal for the inglorious shedding of blood. If I return. My men and I have been tasked to defend a bridge. The Prussians sent their men across. Cruelly we waited until they made it halfway, seeking to avenge some forgotten slight they had perpetrated on our side. Through my field glasses, I could see their countenance relax as they felt relief after having assumed their next breath would be their last. It was at that point I ordered my men to open fire. They unleashed a merciless fury upon the now unsuspecting foe. I am ashamed to admit the joy I felt at their demise. Even the next day, when they returned to claim their dead, the Tsar's artillery rained down hellfire and brimstone on them. The barrage started as a few loud explosions, but soon reached a cacophony of death that I swore the shells blotted out the sun. Smoke hugged the ground as dearly as the men our munitions fell upon. At the end of the salvo, the bridge had been destroyed. And yet, the butchers were determined to cross that damned river. They attempted to forge through water that came up to their necks. Once more, it was up to the marksmanship and machine guns of the men under my command to prevent the pigs from reaching our side of the riverbank. After the engagement, the river ran red with the blood of 5,000 to 6,000 Bacchia bastards. I apologize if I have placed too much on your lithe shoulders. I wish I did not have to embrace this darkness. The unfortunate truth is that if myself and men like me did not, the cost of Hun barbarity would be borne by you and the rest of Russian womanhood. I love you and beg you to pray for my deliverance from this evil. Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev. 30 January 1917, Kovno-Wilna Minsk Governorate. Zaya. Pray for my salvation, though I do not believe any of us who so eagerly marched into this madness will ever be saved. I have come to hope there is no God. I wish I could say that it was only because I see no evidence of him here. That would be rational. Instead, I hope for it because I have seen a glimpse of the wrath of his judgment on me because of my sins. Nature has returned. A large pack of wolves has descended upon a village 30 kilometers from my encampment. The attacks began with livestock and then the men. It did not go unnoticed that the beasts were avoiding the women and children of the village. One of my snipers was dispatched to hunt the alpha male of the pack, which he successfully did. The senior sergeant, an ancient peasant who hunted wolves in Siberia, assured me that once the alpha was killed, the pack would retreat into the wild, seeking prey elsewhere. Some of the men began speculating that the wolves were displaying more humanity than us. Such talk has become more common across the motherland as ingrates speak against our glorious Tsar. News of trouble has reached us at the front, and High Command has directed us to purge ourselves of any socialists in our midst. I watched as we put to the bullet some of our bravest men. How can we fight the enemy when we're tearing ourselves apart not only at home, but on the front itself? While other officers had found the Bolshevik menace in their ranks, I am proud to say that I have not heard any such grumblings from my brave men. Not even Junior Sergeant Sazonov, who is exceptionally educated for a man of peasant stock. I have every confidence in the men under my command to fight bravely for our homeland. I love you. Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev. 25 February 1917, Kovno-Wolno-Minsk, Governorate. Zaya, despite my newfound agnosticism, I kneel in prayer every night that the revolutionary insanity has not reached you and that you are safe. If there is a God, may he protect you from the violence. The wolves, the hellhounds did not disperse as Senior Sergeant Elibakov promised. I doubt he truly killed the Alpha. The foul beasts have begun targeting soldiers. It began with our dead and wounded being dragged from where they fell. Then the creatures got bolder and snatched the dead and most of the wounded from our aid stations. At first, when our rear guard began disappearing, we thought they had deserted, until we found the savaged remains of a man. His uniform in tatters. His bones, save his head, had been picked clean. It was as if his face was left for us to find, for us to stare into his unblinking, questioning eyes. At night, the howls of the pack keep us from sleep, invading our nightmares and robbing what little respite from our horrible reality is left to us. 2 days ago, members of the pack invaded the battlefield, preying upon the dead and dying and menacing anyone seeking to give the fallen aid. A few of the more cunning and daring animals began taking advantage of soldiers distracted by combat and attacking the able-bodied. In the midst of battle, something miraculous happened. A Hun butcher and a noble Russian peasant began working together to attack a common foe. Once the pack retreated into the woods, a Prussian officer approached under a flag of truce while the men began helping clear the battlefield of the dead and tending to the wounded, the uniform momentarily notwithstanding. The officer, a man of my rank and age, appraised me. I wondered if I looked as simultaneously young and old to him as he did to me. They had been suffering through the same incredible torment as we, and they offered a temporary truce. My superiors wisely agreed, and I assigned Senior Sergeant Elibakov and Junior Sergeant Sazonov to select a few men to go with the Prussians and hunt the wolves down. When they returned, they reported the end of many of our lupine tormentors. My colonel, an inadequate man named Markusha Milovich, wanted pelts, but they had none. The 2 non-commissioned officers were shaken by my questioning. "You won't believe us, sir," the senior sergeant explained. "The pack dragged the carcasses into the woods. I've never seen wolves do this with their dead. My little Zaya, I have fought with these men, and I trust them with my life. Looking into their eyes, I knew they were not lying to me. Colonel Milovich did not share my faith in my men. He ordered me to personally attend tomorrow's hunt. I must rest now. I love you. Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev." This was the last recorded letter from Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev. From here, the historical record goes cold. Lost in the fog of the Bolshevik Revolution are any other letters home from the Eastern Front or even death certificates for either Andrei or Alexandra Alexiev. In the search for the staff captain's fate, a letter was found from the aforementioned Sergeant Sazonov, full name Pyotr Ivanich Sazonov, to a member of the Petrograd Cheka, pleading for mercy on behalf of Mrs. Alexiev. This letter serves as the only indication of her husband's death. The infamous Cheka was the Soviet Union's first secret police force, and Sergeant Sazonov became a member serving in the branch responsible for his home city of Moscow. The events the then Comrade Sazonov described are incredible and defy belief. Unable to find other documentation about Andrei Alexiev, this letter was included as a historical oddity in the interest of maintaining the integrity of the historical record. What follows are the ramblings of a man deeply broken by what he witnessed in the war to end all wars. After all, serious persons do not believe in that which belongs to the realm of delusions and antiquated superstition. Werewolves. 24 January 1920, Moscow. Comrade Sergei Timovyevich Nikolaev. You do not know me. I am Pyotr Ivanovich Sazonov, and I am a Chekist serving in the Cheka rooting out counter-revolutionaries in Moscow. It has come to my attention that you are holding a petite bourgeoisie widow named Alexandra Alexiev. I served with her husband in the last imperialist war. He was a good man, and he protected me from being murdered for my belief in the communist revolution. He thought it was insanity that the Tsar's army would put brave men who were fighting not for a cruel and corrupt monarch, but for the Russian people, to death. He told me that he made sure to speak of my bravery and patriotism often, even in letters home. I believe this is what kept myself and several other clandestine revolutionaries alive, and, given time, I would have converted this brave man into a good communist. His only concern over the revolution was that it put his beloved Zaya in danger. Is that counter-revolutionary, or just a devoted husband, an example of the best of Russian manhood? His actions continuously went against his class, and if Mrs. Alexiev is worthy of his devotion, I believe with a little re-education she can be reformed into a productive member of the proletariat. Comrade Nikolaev, let me share with you how her husband died. Once more, acting against his class interest and sacrificing himself for the proletariat. Colonel Milovich was our commanding officer and a small man full of distrust. I think he knew that I was a communist and, worse, a Jew. He didn't trust me, and it didn't help that Comrade Mikhail Alibekov was a Cossack and not a true Russian. It was the first hunt of the wolf truce, and we did not return with the pelts as Colonel Milovich directed. He ordered Comrade Alexiev to accompany us on the following day's hunt, along with 3 Prussians, 2 infantrymen, and a medic. We set out 3 hours before dawn. We thought we would track the pack through the woods. Comrade Alibekov suggested we carry traditional torches instead of the electric ones our momentary allies brought with them, something our Tsarist commanders thought a luxury wasted on common enlisted men. The Cossack thought it would be best to save the weaker electric torches for peering into the crevices and shallow caves where wolves tended to make dens. As we entered the dark woods, we heard howls from our flanks, as if the pack leader placed scouts to warn of our approach. The Prussians shrank with fear, and even Comrade Alibekov trembled. I will admit that the sound made me shiver and grip my rifle tighter as we marched deeper into the dark. I don't know if Comrade Alexiev was scared, but he stood tall and unwavering as we moved deeper into the woods. We could hear paws crunching the snow as shadows crossed our path, taunting us with growls and sounds I've never heard from man nor beast. Even Alibekov, a renowned huntsman in his hometown, claimed the sound unnatural. "It's like the wolves are laughing at us," he observed. "Have you ever heard a wolf laugh?" I asked. "Wolves cannot laugh. I do not know what these demons are," he said. I'll never forget the alert fear in that large man's eyes. "Enough," the staff captain ordered. "You're frightening yourselves." His voice was iron and helped me find my spine. We charged another 50 yards before the first attack. It came suddenly when 2 wolves took out the rear guard. They went straight for the men's throats, intending to silence them so they wouldn't alert us. Fortunately, one wolf missed his mark, and the victim was able to cry out. We spun as a group. Comrade Alibekov's rifle immediately shouldered, he took aim. The rifle cracked, echoing in the dense forest, and was followed by a canine squeal of pain. The animals took off into the dark, leaving behind the cooling corpse of the only Prussian who spoke Russian and a mangled soldier. The medic began bandaging his wounded comrade. The staff captain took in the situation. Circle around the wounded man. He stepped over to the corpse and took the dead man's rifle as Alibekov and I took up a defensive posture. The captain handed the wounded soldier, who could no longer shoulder a rifle, his pistol. When the medic was done with his work, Alexiev pointed to the wounded man's rifle. The medic didn't understand Russian, but understood the intent. Shooting an animal not being a violation of his oath to heal, he armed himself and took a defensive position. We'll hold until light, then we'll follow the blood trail, our staff captain said. We waited, the cold seeping into our bones as we stopped moving. We could hear the beasts moving through the brush. Our faint lights kept the corpse in shadow, allowing the wolves to nab the carcass and drag it into the night. A few of us reflexively fired at targets we couldn't see. Cease fire, Staff Captain Alexiev shouted. You're wasting ammo. As night surrendered to day, the sound of stalking wolves faded. We could now follow the trail left behind by the monsters as they dragged the bleeding body on the way back to their den. After a few kilometers, we stumbled upon a cave. Outside, the remains of the man laid, now little more than bloody bones with chunks of meat clinging to the skeleton. His uniform was strewn about the small clearing in tatters. However, the cruel beasts left his head intact, the man's eyes frozen open in mocking warning. Fuck these animals, the staff captain said as the medic retched behind us. Let's go get some pelts. He took off toward the opening of the cave and we followed. Comrade Alibekov was deeply troubled as we moved inside. What's wrong? I asked, not really wanting to know. I've seen wolves live in caves. This seems a little big. Not impossible. Just feels off. He shrugged. Oh well. Sometimes you eat the bear. Sometimes the bear eats you. It's the Russian way. We should use the Prussian torches now. The captain put the injured man in the lead and the medic in the rear, their faint electric light enough to hold the shadows at bay. Although we saw the twinkling of what the huntsman called eye shine staring back at us from the darkness. Bones crunched under our feet. Our guide quieted our fears, saying that these were animal remains, the normal prey of wolves. Light flashed and we turned and saw the medic's torch on the ground. Its small light bulb pointed toward the cave ceiling. The man's body was dragged into the shadows as a blur flashed between me and Comrade Alibekov. The way his eyes went wide and his mouth opened in a silent scream still haunts my nightmares. Blood from a gaping throat wound spurted on me. Before I knew it, this strong, proud man was gone. The other Prussian dropped his torch, breaking the delicate light bulb, and ran blindly into the darkness screaming. Alexiev composed himself and calmly retrieved our one working electric torch. We finished this. One way or another, Sergeant. Our comrades' deaths shall not be in vain. I nodded and followed him into what I realized was hell. Eventually, our light fell upon Prussian boots and a collared wolf with a brown coat who sat studying us with unusually intelligent eyes. We raised our weapons. However, before we could pull the trigger, the creature began to change. Comrade Nikoliev, I understand that what follows will strike you as madness. I pledge to you that it is true. With the creaking of bone and several other disturbing unnatural sounds, the wolf turned into a naked woman. Her brown hair flowed down her back. Brown eyes studied us as we stood, mouths agape. She laughed, joined by the howls of the other wolves echoing off the walls. You boys look surprised. Have you never seen a naked woman before? She stepped over the corpse of the fallen Prussian as if he were nothing more than a felled tree. In any other situation, I would have found her irresistible. But when I noticed her lips stained with blood, I saw her as a monster. The captain was quicker to snap out of disbelief. You have killed brave men, innocent soldiers. He shouldered his rifle. Once more, she mocked us with her laugh. Innocent? Her head tilted back as she laughed from her belly. Put your weapons down. You are already dead. My pack will kill you before you squeeze the trigger." I could hear a growl, but I could not see the beast it belonged to. "There are no innocent soldiers. You kill one another. Treat each other as if neither of you was human. All the while making civilians and nature pay the price for your glory in bits of ribbon." "Who are you?" my staff captain asked. "I am Svetlana Volkov." She shook her head sadly. "My father was like you. Marched for the Tsar in Crimea and came back a broken man. He would drink and beat us. I ran away from home, determined never to return. I was lucky when my mate found me near his den, turned me, and made me one of his pack. He was the alpha, and soon I learned the ways of the pack, how to help lead them as their alpha female. We knew peace until your folly came and destroyed our home, forcing us to feed upon the flesh of your dead and soon to be dead. Then your huntsman murdered my mate. All I have left of him is this," she said, gesturing to the collar around her neck. She moved her hair aside to reveal the ruby pendant hanging from it. "It became more than survival. It became about revenge." She turned her back on us. "I grow bored. It is time for you to die." "Wait," Comrade Alexiev yelled. "Spare my sergeant." She turned. "Do not make demands of me. I beg you." She looked at me, her eyes chilling me to my core. "Why does he deserve life, over even yours?" "He fights only because he is forced by a corrupt imperialistic czar. He has educated me on the plight of the people and shown me the error of my own ways. He's also a Jew, and like your own people, persecuted. He hates this war. What better way to show you are not a monster than by letting a man such as this carry your message back to our commanders?" She considered this a moment. "Go, before I change my mind." I looked at Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev, and he nodded as he dropped his rifle. I ran into the darkness moments before I heard him start to scream. There would be no good death for the officer. As I ran, I heard the sound of paws in pursuit, furry bodies pushing and guiding me toward the cave entrance. The sounds of my comrade dying echoed behind me. Then happily, I saw light and fresh cold air stinging my lungs. I was happy to be alive for only a moment before the guilt over surviving set in. I turned back toward the den to see the two shapeshifters who guided me out snarl before turning and bounding back into the darkness. I eventually made it back to camp, having decided not to tell my superiors what had happened. Instead, I told them that the wolves had become even more savage and murdered the squad. Colonel Milovich did not take kindly to what he deemed desertion, and I spent the remainder of my time in the imperialist army in confinement. When the Tsar's abdication a month later threw the army into disarray, I was able to escape to join the October Revolution. As you can see, Comrade Nikoliev, Alexander Alexiev's husband was a hero of the people, despite coming from a landed family and being commissioned by the Tsar to fight in the imperialistic army. He was aware of the damage his class and the aristocracy were doing to the people of Russia, and knowing his character, I believe he would choose a wife of the same mind. I humbly request your assistance in this matter, and beg you to consider releasing the wife of Comrade Alexiev to my custody. With ardent fraternal greetings, Chekist Pyotr Ivanovich Sazonov. Thus ends the only eyewitness account of the mythical Wolf Truce of 1917. Staff Captain Andrei Alexiev's account is as sober and credible as his sergeant's tale of wolves shape-shifting into beautiful women is madly incredible. However, this letter should not be dismissed entirely. Chekist Sergei Timovyovich Nikoliev was regarded by peers as a superstitious man prone to believe in country folklore about fairies and goblins. Therefore, Sazonov may have been constructing a fiction to portray a man who saved him from execution as even more valiant than he was. Despite the fantastic nature of this final letter, this record is meant to finally put to rest doubts regarding the historical veracity of this event as reported in U.S. newspapers of the time.
My name is Aramis Churchton. On December 14th, 2004, I came to the town of Belconson, Maryland, in order to spend a night in a tenantless house on a quiet road. It was a 3-hour drive from the western part of the state, and I arrived shortly after 10 p.m., parking my car almost a half-mile away. I walked onto the property and went around to the back of the house unnoticed, as it sat on 7 acres of fairly isolated scrubland. The previous owners, the Marclay family, had left a month before, after their daughter was kidnapped. The nearest neighbor was screened off by a thick stretch of trees to the east. The temperature when I arrived was slightly less than 30 degrees. I broke into the basement door with a crowbar and entered the house. The Marclays had left the heat on inside, and it was comfortably warm. I removed the flashlight from my backpack and shone it in front of me as I walked through the house. I did not want to turn any lights on yet for fear of drawing unwanted attention. The house was large and fully furnished. Everywhere there was evidence of a normal family life, and no obvious signs that it had been interrupted by tragedy. The house had 3 bedrooms. One of them was Glory Marclay's. She was 7 years old when she was abducted in the middle of the night. A ransom note had been left behind, written by a man who only called himself Swan. Nothing had been touched in her bedroom. It was filled with her drawings and possessions. I looked through every room in the house, the study, the playroom, the 3 bathrooms, the kitchen. In there, I studied a picture fastened with a magnet to the refrigerator. Glory had created it in red and green crayon. It showed a girl in a ruffled dress carrying an archer's quill on her back and holding a giant bow. Glory had signed it below the girl's feet. I then went back down to the basement, where I felt the house's presence the strongest. I had little to do but wait. I decided to pass the time by reading the notes my colleague Xavier Dowd had made since July regarding potential investigations we would soon embark upon. I fully expected Theodore Gant's ghost to appear in some form before too many hours had passed. I had brought no monitoring equipment so as to not frighten him away. Almost immediately after I settled in, there were 3 sharp, evenly spaced raps against the basement door. I rose from the chair I was sitting in and walked into the tiny alcove where the door was. I couldn't see anything through the pane of glass set at eye level because there was too much frost. So, I opened the door. I looked up the narrow flight of cement steps that led up to ground level and saw nothing there. The knocking had most likely been a simple physical preamble from the ghost I had come to Belconson to encounter. His full name was Theodore Gerald Gant, and he had bought the house in 1968 after his wife, Zoya, died under mysterious circumstances. She had suffered a sudden heart attack at the age of 41. It was the expression on her face that gave the paramedics pause. Her teeth had been clenched as if in anger, biting so hard on her upper lip she had punctured the skin there. Nor would they forget the bizarre way her eyes had become somehow disconnected within their sockets. They rolled like loose marbles as they carried her away. Theodore Gant had been discharged from the army in 1944 as a Section 8. He was observed by 3 different psychiatrists who all found him utterly delusional. He had been stationed with the Africa Corps, but after his discharge he did not return to the States for over 3 years, disappearing instead into the forests south of Zaire. It was believed that he spent those years deeply involved in the study of the witchcraft practices of the Gai Koltu, a primal tribe to whom zombification was an everyday practice. His private papers mentioned extensive experiments with cannibalism while he lived inside that little scene community. Only after his death, when those private letters and papers were opened, was the extent of his psychosis revealed. He kept over 2,000 pages of diaries and a huge number of notebooks between 1941 and 1973. The diaries were found in a sealed room by Gant's brother, Bernard, who took custody of Theodore's 2 children in 1973. Theodore believed that in Africa he had become a Valpurdim, a kind of brain vampire who killed in order to eat the minds of his victims, in the belief that the amassed intelligence would grow and grow inside him. Theodore claimed in the diaries that he had no control over this affliction, and also that he had killed 11 people since 1948, eating their brains and dumping the bodies in a nearby river after they were dead. The diaries hinted that Theodore hatched plans to poison his wife over the course of 6 months, and he did actually commit this deed after she found some incriminating evidence of his crimes and confronted him with his delusion. After Theodore Gant's suicide, his brother, Bernard, a prominent local businessman, found the diaries and turned them over to the police. The papers were then lost, never to be recovered. Bernard took care of his brother's children for just 2 years, and then he himself died in a fall from a ladder in 1975. The children became wards of the state until they legally inherited his fortune. They moved far away. I had not been able to find out what became of them. Theodore Gant vowed in his diaries that he would haunt the house he owned after his death in order to protect his papers from probing outsiders. Those papers, of course, weren't inside the house anymore. They had long since been confiscated by the police and quite probably destroyed. Neighbors and those who had occasionally occupied this house over the past 3 decades had in the past noted strange noises and odd human shapes within at various times. Before the Marclay family bought it in 2002, the house had attained a joking reputation as a haunted place. The most well-known urban legend was that if one looked through the window of the east bedroom, which looked out on faraway Route 212, you could sometimes see a heavy-set, bespectacled man standing by the road. He would place his hands over his face and sink to his knees, and then mysteriously disappear. Because this sort of sighting had on occasion been attributed to children, there was reason for extra caution when I began my investigation. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m., I did little inside the house but stand for several minutes in the center of the dark living room. I listened to the almost undetectable subtone the house gave off for signs that its energy level was migrating toward any particular area. It didn't seem so. But there was a slight change in the tone inside Glory Marclay's bedroom. It was there that I chose to perform an attraction. I sat down at the little girl's tiny red desk and settled onto the blue wooden chair beside it, which had been designed for a human 1/3 my size. I switched on the table lamp. Atop the desk there was a Mickey Mouse pencil cup, a sketch pad, and a calendar showing a different sort of horse for every month. I moved these things out of the way and set my backpack on the desk, along with a glass of water. From the pack, I removed a charcoal pencil. Sensing something, I turned to look at Glory Marclay's small bed. On the coverlet lay 3 dolls. I noticed for the first time that the room was filled with them. There were giraffes, dogs, dinosaurs, fashion models, infants, cowgirls, and astronauts. For some reason, the 3 dolls sitting on the bed, staring in my direction, were the ones with the largest eyes. I began to rub the tip of the pencil back and forth across my open left palm so that the charcoal marked my skin. Then, I continued in the other direction, cross-hatching. Soon, my palm was entirely black. I sat the pencil down and made a tight fist with my left hand. I closed my eyes, and they remained closed for the next 10 minutes. Slowly, I tightened my fist more and more until my nails were digging into my palm and my muscles began to tremble. I could feel the temperature inside the house climb by 2 or 3 degrees as I performed the attraction. When I finally thought it was time to open my eyes, I unclenched my fist. Virtually all of the charcoal had vanished from my hand. It had left behind only a string of tall, thin black letters. The letters had made this message on my flesh. He, M, my, KLL, he. I stared at these letters for the better part of 20 minutes. I could not fill in the gaps between the letters with anything that made immediate sense. I eventually transcribed the sequence onto a piece of paper and placed it inside the pocket of my shirt. I left the charcoal markings on my palm as well. I heard the wind picking up severely outside the house. With the heat cut off, the temperature inside it should have been falling, but the thermometer I had brought with me showed otherwise. It had actually climbed 2 degrees. The temperature in the basement was identical to other locations above ground. I had hoped for this. It was a positive sign. I had my first visitor at 12:40 a.m. I had been standing in the furnished basement, looking at several photographs of the Marclay family that had been set up on top of a small stereo system. Mrs. Marclay had been a stern-faced woman in her 40s, and the photographic progression showed that she had lost a great deal of weight over the course of a few years, and not in a healthy manner. In the last photograph of her and her only child together, she seemed to be staring into some middle space, lost. There were 3 sharp knocks on the basement door. These knocks were identical in every way to those I had heard 2 hours before. I did not need a formal analysis to know that the spiky pattern those knocks would have made on a Vox-Track grid back at the university would have matched the earlier ones precisely. A man of about 25 stood outside on the top step. He wore thick, comically bookish glasses, and his eyes were barely visible. He wore a heavy flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too big, and stained dark blue sweatpants over a pair of ill-fitting corduroys. His sneakers were the sort one would usually see on a young boy. He greeted me and told me his name was Ben, and that he lived next door. His power had gone out and he did not have any candles, so he asked to borrow some. I said yes, and invited him to come inside while I looked for them. At this suggestion, Ben seemed both frightened and fascinated, as if he had never been inside another's house. After a long moment, he came in. As he moved past me, there was absolutely no sense of physical human presence to him. I turned on a single lamp in the basement so he would not be standing in the dark. I was able to find some candles quite quickly, having seen some on the Marclays' dining room table. I retrieved them and hurried back down to the basement, where the visitor stood awkwardly, unmoving, in a corner. I held the candles in my hand and did not offer them just yet, wanting to extract as much information as I could. Through a series of careful questions, I was able to learn much from Ben. He told me in a very small voice that he had lived next door for 1 year with his brother, who had gone out tonight to Parsonsburg. When I asked Ben what he did for a living, he seemed baffled by the question and told me that neither he nor his brother worked, that they had inherited some money from their uncle, who had been a real estate investor. His brother's name was Donovan, and he took care of all the money. When I asked Ben what his last name was, he replied, Gant. It confirmed what I had already assumed. As the conversation, or what passed for conversation, lengthened, Ben became visibly more nervous and no longer made eye contact with me. On 2 separate occasions, he asked me for the time. He was obviously very anxious to get back home. I noticed also that speaking the name of his brother caused him distress. He asked me what I did for a living, and I told him I was a sort of psychologist. Instead of asking a follow-up question, he inquired immediately if I was sleeping when he had knocked on the door. Even though I said no, he then asked me if I had been dreaming. He seemed only partially connected to the room and to our exchange of words, as if most of his mind were completely occupied. Ben then said a most disturbing thing, that Donovan made him relate all his dreams to him. When I asked him why this was, he merely stared off into the distance, and after several seconds refocused, having apparently forgotten what I had asked. I asked more questions about Donovan, but the answers were vague. Donovan had worked for a time in a nursery, but had stopped. The two of them did not leave the house unless they had to. It had been that way, Ben said, for a long time. I was able to eventually glean the reason for his nervousness. His brother had gone out for groceries, and Ben was anxious to know how long such an errand might take. Surely he was risking something by venturing outside of his house and wanted to return as soon as he could so as to not arouse suspicion that he had dared leave. At the end of our talk, Ben blurted out that what he really wanted to borrow was a radio, because he wanted to hear what the newscasters had to say about the snowstorm that was on its way. When I told him I would gladly try to find one for him somewhere in the house, he again asked me how long it would take for Donovan to return from Parsonsburg. I left him one more time and navigated the stairs up to the main floor with a flashlight. There was a small portable radio in Glory Marclay's room. For some reason I am not sure of, I felt the need to reach out and touch the head of one of the staring dolls resting on her bed. The plastic was very warm to the touch. I left the room and returned to the basement. I handed the radio to the ghost of Benjamin Gant. He took it, and his mouth began to quiver, as if he were about to cry. He told me he had to go and walked to the door quickly. I opened it for him, and he moved past me, climbing the steps and disappearing around the side of the house into the freezing dark. I had heard that both Ben and his brother Donovan had died, but I had not been able to find much out about either one of them. I knew that I was meant to follow Ben, that he was involving me in a playlet of sorts. Where it would lead was a mystery to me. I let 10 minutes pass and then I stepped out into the cold, taking my backpack with me out of sheer reflex. There were flurries falling lightly as a snowstorm moved in from the north. The land was entirely dark. Far away, I could see the dim glow of lights on the side of Route 41. I started to walk in that direction. It was 75 yards or so across the Marclay property, which was cut off from the adjacent property by that tall screen of trees. I parted it and came out on the other side, in view of the closest house to the Marclays. This one was in a state of total disrepair, having been abandoned some time ago. I walked unnoticed across the large, unkempt lawn, wrapping my scarf tightly around my neck. From what the ghost had told me, I believed it was possible that this house was where Ben and his brother Donovan had lived after their father's death. It had most likely been sold or simply given to them by their Uncle Bernard. Half the windows of the house were boarded up, and the front door was firmly padlocked. It seemed unusual to me that a house on such a desirable stretch of property should stay abandoned. There was no way in unless I wanted to climb in through a low window, which was not boarded and whose glass pane had long since been removed. I decided to try it. I managed to push myself over the window ledge and fall into the darkened house. I was grateful to be at least out of the wind, if not the cold. I could see almost nothing inside the house. Large portions of the walls were hacked away. There was no furniture left, just debris. Almost right away, I could make out a small object sitting precariously atop a pile of what looked like wood paneling. I walked over to it and lifted it. It was a book, bound in imitation black leather. The interior pages were college-ruled. A price sticker was still attached to the lower right-hand corner of the back cover, and an orange paint stain streaked the spine. It was a diary. Obviously, it had been left for me as part of the manufactured drama, and I sat down with my back against one corner of the house, turned on my flashlight, and sat down to read it. I suspected it would tell me where to find Ben next. As I read, I sometimes had to turn my head to breathe so that the cloud of my breath would not obscure my vision. The diary was written in Ben Gant's childlike handwriting. It began on April 10th of an undetermined year and covered approximately 1 month of the young man's life. Benjamin began his first entry by describing how his brother Donovan ordered him to submit to treatment with a Dr. Spawn, because Ben was getting to be more and more of a burden to Donovan. One day, Donovan drove Ben into the city after Ben made sure to hide his diary carefully to avoid one of his brother's almost daily inspections of his personal belongings. Benjamin had found this Dr. Spawn, who claimed to be a psychiatrist, to be very strange. His hands were twice as big as Benjamin's, or so he wrote, and Spawn was in his 80s. While Donovan waited in a car down the street, Spawn had asked Ben question after question about his heart condition. The man had gone out of his way to show Ben his medical degree and textbooks. Ben was obviously frightened of Spawn. Later that night, Ben heard Donovan on the phone, laughing and talking to Spawn. Ben was hypnotized by the doctor for the first time on a Saturday. It was Spawn's intention to use the power of subconscious suggestion to alleviate Ben's general sense of fear of the world. Ben barely remembered what happened after he lapsed into unconsciousness. He found himself walking down the street, but he could barely hear any sounds. He watched people pass him silently, and he became aware that his brother was following his progress with the car from behind him. Ben wrote that the sunlight had been changed somehow into dark shades of purple and black, as if night and day had been reversed. It felt nice to him. The next thing he remembered was waking up on Dr. Spawn's couch. Spawn was very happy. He said that they had already made a tremendous amount of progress. Ben and Donovan ate at a hamburger place on the way back to their house, and Ben wrote that Donovan forced him to eat more than he should have. The next day, Ben sat looking out his bedroom window while he was supposed to be asleep. He had been given some kind of tablets to swallow, but he had concealed them in his palm. Ben saw Dr. Spawn's car pull up to the house, and the old man visited with Donovan. Ben did not leave his room for 2 days. Daylight hurt his eyes and his throat. He only felt better when night came. The diary's next entry told of Ben's third visit to Dr. Spawn's office. By this time, the daylight stung his hands. This time, while Ben was under hypnosis, Spawn walked with him. It was already dark when they went out onto the street. There was now no sound in Ben's ears, but he liked the feeling of the darkness now that the sun had gone down. Ben drifted by him, and Dr. Spawn's hand never left his shoulder. Spawn talked profusely, but Ben couldn't hear a word of it. After a time, they left the main roads and walked through the back streets and alleys. Once they went by a cemetery, and Spawn stopped him there, talking very quickly, pointing and gesturing almost angrily. Then, the two of them went on. Ben got a little dizzy, and at some point Spawn was actually pulling him along with his large hand over Ben's wrist. Then, they were in a place near the bay, where the city's garbage was sent out from the harbor on scows. Ben remembered tall buildings with broken windows. Spawn pointed at someone walking around there. To Ben, the person was just a shape made out of blue. Spawn made Ben run after the shape, but it had gotten away from him. He was too slow and clumsy. And so, Ben wrote, Dr. Spawn went after it. Ben awoke back in his room with Donovan standing over him. He said that Ben needed more therapy with Spawn. But when they returned to the office the next day, there was no answer at the interior door. Ben opened it to find many of Spawn's books and papers scattered around messily. Ben lifted one of the books to find it was a medical text designed for a high school educational level. In the margins of its pages were scrawled dozens upon dozens of handwritten notes. Ben left the office and returned to the car where Donovan was waiting. Furious, Donovan went up to the office to find Spawn, but was not able to. He drove Ben home, and on the way he told him that he himself would hypnotize Ben from now on. He said he had learned from Spawn how to do it. The diary ended with Ben reporting a series of headaches, which dissipated dramatically at night. Donovan made him a deal. If Ben behaved and caused no further trouble with his fears, they could drive out to a different part of the city and walk around amongst those welcoming, silent purple and black shadows. I left the diary where I had found it and climbed out the window through which I had entered. Standing on the lawn, I looked to the west. Route 41 rose and stretched toward a faraway hill. Under the full moon, I could see a human figure standing in the middle of the road, about 100 yards away. I could not see any details, but when the figure turned and began to walk over the hill and out of sight, I decided to follow on foot, certain it was Benjamin Gant. The wind rose, and in less than a minute my face was almost numb from the cold as I got closer to the road. Upon my leaving the abandoned property and setting foot on 41, a single car rolled past me. I tried to use its headlights to see farther down the road. There was no sign of the ghost. I knew that Ben's physical actions should closely mimic those of a living human's, at least for a while, and so I reversed direction and jogged for a few hundred yards towards the car I had brought to the Marclay house. I got inside out of the cold and started the engine. I pulled onto 41, and within a minute I was at the place where I thought Ben had stood. Further ahead, the road curved to the right between two farms. I saw no one. I covered another 4 miles before I pulled over. Almost no cars went past. That was when I spotted Ben, far ahead, standing under a lamppost beside a thick stretch of trees. I pulled back onto the road and drove toward him. He turned and walked into the woods. I drove right past them on a hunch. Another mile later, there Ben was, walking over a dark, hilly field on the other side of the road entirely. I kept going straight. 5 minutes passed, then almost 10, and I saw Ben once more. This time, I could see nothing more than a silhouette, but the way the tail of his long flannel shirt was ruffled by the wind gave him away, and the fact that no thinking human would be standing in the middle of a cemetery by the side of a road in such brutal temperatures. I had never seen this sort of behavior from a ghost, appearing and disappearing without regard to the laws of motion and geography. I did not know what it meant. I pulled over, and for a few minutes I did nothing but watch Ben as he stood between the rows of silhouetted tombstones. He seemed to be looking down at one of them in particular. I reached to shut the heating fan on the dashboard off, and when I looked up again, he was gone. I got out of the car and walked into the cemetery. I knew I would only be able to stay there for a few minutes. The cold was just unbearable, even though the flurries had stopped. I walked to the approximate place where he had been standing. I could make out his name on the headstone in front of me. His brother's grave was beside his. The dates of their deaths matched. The thought of a murder-suicide instantly entered my mind. I returned to the car and drove on down the road, planning to return to Theodore Gant's house. It was now well past 1 a.m. I drove a longer distance than I wanted to, looking for a place to turn around, but there was only empty land ahead, and I would have to turn around in the middle of the road. Then, I saw a road branching off to the right, and I took it, hoping to circle around. But this road twisted and turned again and again, and I was about to give up on it when yet another road turned again to the right, all but assuring me of a simple way back to where I had come from, but I had no such luck. After a full mile of driving on this road, I didn't seem to be going in the ideal direction anymore, and at one point, when I took a fork to the left, I believed I was on a different route entirely. I saw the lights on a small service station up ahead, the only business I had seen in the area. I pulled onto the tarmac and parked beside one of the 2 gas pumps. There was another car there, at the adjacent one, a white, idling pickup truck. I walked to the cashier's office, which was abutted by a small garage, and went inside. Behind the counter was a rotund man in his 50s, slumped in a chair. He was swaddled in a massive blue coat. A name tag underneath it suggested he owned the place. I greeted him, but he did not immediately respond. He was staring intently through the window blinds that looked out on the tarmac. I asked him for directions back to Route 41, and for a moment he said absolutely nothing, didn't even turn his head. I repeated my question, and he said only, "He's been out there 15 minutes. When I asked him what he was talking about, he said that the white pickup truck outside had pulled in 15 minutes before, and no one had gotten out. I asked the man why he didn't go out to the full-service pump and tend to him. He replied that he couldn't go out there, and now, neither could I. Frustrated by his opacity, I asked him what he was talking about, and the proprietor of the station told me in a low, strangled voice, as if he were afraid of creating the smallest sound. Never once did he look at me. He riveted his stare through the blinds. He believed the man outside, sitting in the pickup truck, whom I had not looked at even for a moment, was the same man who had been spoken about on the radio that night. The news had made mention of a wanted serial killer, nicknamed Father Bones, who had been spotted in the area just a few hours earlier by a convenience store clerk. His description had been posted all over town. Even I had heard of him. I looked outside through the glass door. The pickup truck kept idling, spewing out exhaust. It was impossible to see into the cab of the truck. The truck was old and beaten. I told the proprietor that he was being absurd. I based this mostly on his frustratingly childish and terrified demeanor rather than what I truly knew of the facts. But he said the description of the truck was the same. He said he had been able to see the man once as he sat in the truck. Just once. When he shifted and the light struck him just so. And the man would not turn the engine off. Would not get out. Through the glass door, I noticed more details. The truck had a broken left taillight, an American flag sticker on the passenger side door, and a large, muddy splotch on the frontmost visible tire. I could hear the engine rumbling low. I asked the man behind the counter why he didn't just call the police. He said he didn't want to move. He told me this in such a weak voice that I barely heard the last 2 words. He said there was a shotgun in the adjacent room and a phone, but he believed the man out there was watching us very carefully. I said I would call the police for him, and I turned toward the adjacent room. The man told me to stop, but I went anyway, stepping into a very small area beyond which the garage could be entered. It had no lights. There was a phone sitting on a messy desk in the corner, a desk topped with stacks of invoices and boxes of replacement fuses. I picked up the phone and dialed the operator, requesting the police. When she asked me if it was an emergency, I started to say no, but changed my answer to yes. I turned to look into the front counter area, but could not see the owner from my angle. The line clicked, and I waited for someone to answer me. I had a better view of the pickup truck from where I was. The blinds on the window were so old that several of the slats had fallen off over time. I saw that the truck's wipers rested diagonally across its windshield. Still, nothing could be seen inside the cab. which was maddeningly dark. A policeman came on the line. I told him I was at an Arco station on Vegasville Road in Belconson. I was not absolutely sure I was giving him the fully correct information, but I had become very nervous. I told him that the proprietor of the station thought he had recognized a vehicle mentioned on the radio and that it was sitting there right now. That was as far as I got when the low rumble of the pickup truck's engine cut out entirely. A shiver went up my spine and I stopped speaking. The new silence was horribly noticeable. The policeman on the phone asked me one question, and I responded very quietly in the affirmative. I asked him to simply please come, and I lowered the phone. Then, I moved delicately back into the other room. The proprietor was gone. The front door, however, had not been opened. I would have heard the tinkling of the Christmas bells affixed over it. They had greeted me when I came in. He had vanished through some other exit. I very specifically did not look through the front window. Instead, I retreated to the inner office again, 9 or 10 steps that took me out of the sightline of both the cashier's counter and the outside world. I heard a thin reed of sound squeak through the phone. The voice there was trying to tell me that the police would be at the station in a few minutes. I crouched and felt under the desk for the shotgun I had been told was there. There was nothing at all. The only sounds from outside the building then were the wind and the noise of exactly one vehicle passing by on the road. I emerged one last time into the outer room and saw that there was a partially closed exit door beside a soda machine. It led down 2 steps into the rear of the garage, which was utterly dark. I pushed on the cheap wooden door, and the garage came fully into view. I could make out only vague forms. A very large sedan lay inside the garage, its hood open. I stepped cautiously around it. I could see my breath floating in front of me. I lifted my right foot over a toolbox a split second before I would have kicked it and sent it skittering across the cement floor. There was one last door on the far side of the garage. It had no knob. I guided it open gently. The wind struck me hard. Beyond was a thick mass of featureless woods. I edged along the side of the building over the space of a full minute, moving about 12 feet, hating myself for my caution, but unable to deny my disquiet. Then I put my head around the corner of the garage to get a full view of the tarmac. The pickup truck was still sitting there. 10 feet away from it, my own car waited beside the self-service pump. Without pausing to think, I began to walk forward, needing to cover about 40 feet to get inside my car. I fixed my stare on the white pickup and listened for footsteps. I quickened my pace, and it became an awkward trot. I could not remember if I had locked the car, and I had a very vivid mental image of myself setting my keys down on the counter inside the station and forgetting them there while I went to call the police. But it wasn't true. My keys were right in my front pocket. I had never locked the car anyway. I got in, closed the door fast, locked it, and started the engine. There was no movement from the pickup truck. I pressed heavily on the accelerator and turned back onto Vegasville Road without even bothering to look for traffic. I kept the car at a rational 30 miles per hour as I left, looking constantly in the rearview mirror. I nearly ran off once into a ditch. The lights of the station fell behind me. I fully intended to drive all the way back to the Marclay house to resume my vigil for Theodore Gant. But as Vegasville Road wound on and on, making me almost lose my sense of direction yet again, I decided not to return just yet. I still saw only one house every half-mile or so, set well off the road. The area was a series of empty hills and valleys. I pulled off about 15 minutes away from the station onto a long, winding driveway that led up to a dark farmhouse. I stopped just a few yards up the driveway, turned off the car, and sat, listening to the wind. I found myself unable to do anything but sit and wait. I knew I would have to return to the gas station at some point. I knew it. So, I would sit and let some time go by. The first car that passed by me on the road startled me quite badly. Its color was white, but it was not a pickup truck. It was a 2-mile journey. The only evidence of humanity I encountered on the way was the high beams of 2 passing cars. When I saw the lights of the Arco station approaching, I was both discouraged and frightened. There didn't seem to be anyone there at all. As I got closer, I saw that even the white pickup truck was gone. With an unpleasant feeling in my stomach, I crept onto the tarmac, cutting my headlights off. Something seemed very wrong. The police should have still been there. I stopped my car exactly where I had before. I told myself it was silly to feel frightened. I would go into the cashier's office and see if the proprietor was still there, and perhaps buy some coffee and a candy bar. Then, I would find out exactly what had happened. But the lights were out in the service building. I assumed then that the proprietor had gone home for the night, and I felt a sense of real relief. If he had come back to shut the lights off and gone home so quickly after speaking to the police, obviously there had never been any cause for alarm. It had probably been a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. I stepped out onto the tarmac and closed the driver's side door. The wind gusted and slapped the empty husk of a bag of pretzels against my leg. I walked toward the building. The front door was ajar. I stopped and looked at the knob for some time. I was roused from my reverie only by the sound of a car going past. A Mustang doing about 60 miles per hour. I moved into the service building, listening for any movement. The heat had apparently been turned off as well. I couldn't see more than 8 or 10 feet in front of me. There were no signs of anything being amiss. The counter behind which the proprietor had sat was empty save for a stained memo calendar. I went into the adjacent room. Inside, there was one noticeable difference. I found myself unable to focus on anything else for what seemed like minutes. The cord to the telephone stretched from the base on the desk all the way up to the ceiling. A dangling, black, vertical rope. The receiver was hanging from a cardboard advertising mobile above. The receiver rotated gently, touched and guided by a thread of breeze that curled into the building from outside. I reached a hand out to touch the receiver. It was very cold. Then, from behind me, back in the cashier's area, there came a creaking sound. I turned. The sound might have come from as far away as the tarmac outside, or as close as the front door of the service building. It had been a footstep, or something brushing against a window. Through the window blinds, I could see a panel truck rolling past the station on Vegasville Road. The sound of it partially camouflaged a creak that was almost twice as prominent as the first one. I left the interior room, took a left turn at the counter, and pushed my way out of the building entirely. I felt an instant sense of relief when the wind struck me. I would simply get inside my car and never return. I took 1, 2, 3 steps toward my car, and I heard the creaking again, this time very, very close. My heart thudded inside my chest. I stopped after 3 more steps and looked at my car. The rear door closest to me was open. Just an inch, the barest inch. I narrowed in on that visible crack. I hurtled back through my memory to imagine a circumstance in which I may not have fully closed that door. The arc lights above shone down and made the windows of the car only darker. more impenetrable. As I watched, there was then an infinitesimal movement of the rear door. Gently, so as not to make any sound, it was shut from inside by a hand I could not see. There was a small metallic click as the metal components merged. I turned to run. I ran across the tarmac as fast as I could toward Vegasville Road. I did not look back. My feet pounded on the cement. In seconds I was on the road and I kept going, running down the double yellow line into the darkness. I could not even pray for a car to come. My mind was a fog, and all I could hear was my own frantic breathing, and my shoes hitting the pavement harder and harder. In seconds, the cold air was ripping at the insides of my lungs, and I knew I would soon have to collapse. But I did not. The fear kept me moving beyond my physical limits. When the lights of the gas station fell behind me entirely, I was in almost total darkness. It was then that I was most terrified. I kept running. A spike of pain hit me in the chest and my breath began to come in shorter and shorter spurts. No cars came. The wind stung my eyes and my mouth was completely dry. Not even looking where I was running, I almost veered off the road entirely into the woods. I looked down, trying to locate the yellow line, and was unable. I kept running blind. I eventually slowed to almost a jog, utterly unable to go on when headlights washed over me from behind. I turned and instantly knew my own car had come for me, driven by a madman, a killer. But it was a station wagon, beeping its horn at me. To avoid being crushed, I stumbled onto the shoulder as I turned and waved my hands frantically. The station wagon stopped 50 feet beyond me. I ran to it, and suddenly my legs went out from under me. I collapsed and my head hit the pavement, causing consciousness to leave me entirely. I was cursed with a terrible dream that I think I sunk into immediately after hitting the pavement. In it, I had been shot in my right leg with a thick wooden arrow, as if the little archer that Gloria Marclay had drawn back at her house had shot me. The arrow had buried itself just below my knee, and blood pulsated from the wound. Even so, I was chasing someone through the woods, a woman who would not listen to me when I called out for her to stop and help me. She merely ran forward. I was asking her where I was, and what the senseless string of letters that had been mysteriously etched onto my palm in Glory's room meant, and where the nearest hospital was, but she didn't answer. So I chased her. Wounded as I was faster than she. I caught up to her in an empty parking lot, crashing through a blizzard that unleashed itself overhead. And then I saw her face as she turned around to scream. It was the face of Glory Marclay's mother, but instead of apologizing for the mistake, I somehow reached down and ripped the arrow from my leg and thrust it into her chest, again and again, until she fell into the newly fallen snow. As she went down, one of her hands grabbed mine, and the mere act of her desperate touch stripped away the letters on my palm, leaving only an H and an M, just barely visible through the knotted tangle of her blood-soaked hair. When I awoke, I was inside the station wagon that had almost run me down. For a moment, I had no idea why. Then, it came flooding back to me quickly. But the car was parked on the side of the road, a different road than where it had stopped for me. There was no one beside me in the driver's seat. I was alone. The dome light was on. I looked to my right, groggy, unable to focus for a moment. Outside the passenger side window, I saw a dense patch of woods off the shoulder. Looking forward through the windshield, I saw an unfamiliar country road, but immediately recognized a bullet-ridden speed limit sign that I had passed on my way down Route 41. I was less than half a mile from Theodore Gant's old house, and the house that had belonged to his two now dead children. The interior of the station wagon was clean, almost spotless. I could tell nothing from it about who had driven me here, or why they had done it. The clock on the dashboard read 3:24. I got out of the car, lightheaded and still very afraid. I looked around in the dark and stepped around the car, peering into the woods. But there was no one there. I stood for 3 or 4 minutes, shivering, waiting. I had truly been abandoned, but by whom I did not know. I would not wait for whomever it was to come back. I began to walk in the direction of the Marclay house. I had to cross the road to do it. On my way, I looked to my left and saw something that looked like an envelope stuck underneath the station wagon's windshield wipers. I lifted the wipers and found not an envelope, but a single piece of notebook paper. I unfolded it and walked across the road to where a streetlight gave me sufficient illumination to read what was written there. It was only one line, written in the unmistakable clumsy scrawl that I recognized from reading Benjamin Gant's sad diary. The note said only this: "Donovan is waiting for you now." I reached the Marclay house in 15 minutes. I was so exhausted that I spent another quarter of an hour simply huddled in a corner of the dark basement, shivering, trying to get warm. My backpack was gone, left in the back seat of my car back at the gas station. I felt sick, a sickness deep in my bones. When I began to compose myself, I walked through the house, trying to sense if it had become different somehow. With my mind in the state it was in, it was difficult to tell. But there were physical manifestations that told me things had changed. The stairs leading up from the basement were no longer clear. Instead, the entire collection of Dr. Seuss books that I had first seen in the upstairs den at 10 o'clock, 40 or 50 of them, now blocked my way. Each book had been placed there, open and standing, fanning out, the spines facing me. I read the titles as I stepped delicately over them, moving upwards. I knocked one over at the top of the stairs and replaced it carefully. All the dolls that had been in Gloria Marclay's bedroom at the beginning of the evening had been arranged in a duplicate pattern downstairs in the living room, except now, almost every single tiny face had been positioned to stare forward at me as I stood at the room's entrance. They rested on the sofa, on the easy chair, on the ottoman in front of the fireplace screen. The ones with the big eyes now lay on the floor at my feet, face up, seeing nothing more than the ceiling. Glory's drawing of the little Archer girl was no longer fastened to the refrigerator with a magnet. Instead, it lay inexplicably beside Ben Gant's diary on the coffee table in the living room. The diary should not have been there. I lifted Glory's picture, traced my index finger over her signature, counted the sharp arrows in the smiling girl's sling. Then I set the picture down and moved across the room. I needed badly to splash cold water on my face and swallow some of it down. My lungs were still burning. I felt shaky on my feet, groggy and emptied out, as if I were only a shell with no internal organs. My blood pulsed thickly in my temple. A low hum reverberated inside my head from back to front to back again. The best thing for me to have done was to leave the house immediately. In a weakened state, I was at risk. but there were only a couple of hours left before sunrise. I made my way into the bathroom on the main floor of the house and switched the light on. The overhead fluorescence made me wince. I scrubbed my face with the coldest water I could summon, then looked into the mirror to find that a vessel in my left eye had broken, and the cornea that stared back at me was almost entirely red. There was also a thin gash running from my left ear all the way to the fleshiest part of my cheek, a result of my fall to the pavement. I could not look at myself for very long. The overhead light went out with an echoing click, and a second later, the rest of the house went completely dark as well. I put a hand out to silence the faucet. Then, seeing a shadow of something besides my own face in the mirror, I turned slowly to look behind me. A small child's flower print dress clung to the rear wall of the bathroom. My night vision made it out perfectly, even down to the gentle curve of the tiny roses that were scattered in neat, linear patterns down the front. I recognized the dress from one of the many photographs of Glory Marclay spread throughout the house. As I watched, a thin trickle of murky blood peeked out from behind the ruffled collar, then slid downwards over the top 3 buttons, then down even farther, becoming a much thicker stream that quickly reached the end of the fabric and dripped down onto the toilet tank, striking it with dime-sized droplets. I turned away from that sight only when a maddening itch struck my left palm. There was something written on it again, in the same spiky charcoal letters as before, and I saw it was the fulfillment of the original string I had begun upstairs, where Glory Marclay had drawn horses and mountains and archers before she was stolen in the night. The new letters, wedged between and around the first, had been etched so firmly and deeply that my skin had nearly broken. I brought the palm closer to my face and made out the message, misinterpreting it once before it became completely clear. It said this: "Her mommy killed her." I turned the faucet on again and scrubbed my left palm with all the soap in the dish beside the sink, going at it so hard that it began to bleed. 1 minute later, the bathroom light came back on by itself. I left the bathroom and moved into the living room. Someone was waiting for me there. A man stood beside the coffee table, facing away from me. His hands were laced behind his back. He wore a clean white shirt and tan khaki pants. He turned when I stopped. Though the man was very young, his gaze was piercing even in the dark. He greeted me in a low voice and introduced himself as Donovan. He did not smile. His face never changed from one moment to the next. The ghost told me he was looking for his brother, Benjamin. I told him that, yes, Ben had been here, but only for a short while. Donovan asked if he had seemed frightened, and I said yes. He told me not to pay any attention to him, that Ben was very troubled, and that to protect him they stayed in the house most of the time. When I asked what was wrong with Ben, Donovan informed me that he had killed their uncle. It was an accident, Donovan said. They had been sent to live with him after their father died. Bernard had been standing on a ladder one day, fixing the roof. Ben and Donovan had been playing, running around. Ben ran into the ladder, and Bernard grabbed a power line to break his fall. It sent a lethal charge through his body. He was essentially dead for 3 weeks before they took him off life support. Ben was 7. He grew up thinking that he killed Bernard, that he was responsible. His mentality was still a child's, Donovan said. He could not take care of himself. In that moment, I gleaned that in life, Donovan had made sure that Ben was never truly disavowed of the notion that he had caused their uncle's death. I could tell by Donovan's demeanor. I was standing in the presence of evil. There was no mistaking it. He was holding something low at his waist. It was a doll, a pioneer girl, and it had belonged to Glory Marclay. The dolls were still sitting everywhere, having been strangely relocated. Donovan bent gently, almost arthritically at the waist, and set the doll down on the coffee table. Now he saw the other object on the coffee table and reached for it in a motion that seemed planned, rehearsed. He asked me what the object was. I told him that Ben had been keeping a diary and that he had left it here, but also that it revealed very little. Donovan wanted to know if it made accusations, more specifically against him personally. He flipped through the pages idly. I could no longer stand to be so far away. I had to see more detail of Donovan's face. I stepped toward the center of the room, and then I lied, telling him no, there were no accusations. Donovan closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead as if warding off a headache. He was confused, vexed, as to why Ben had left the house. It didn't make sense to him. He wanted me to give him an answer, but I would not do it. When Donovan spoke next, he craned his neck to an unnatural degree, not moving his shoulders even an inch, like a mannequin. He began to speak, softly and slowly, about his uncle. After Theodore Gant died, Donovan said Uncle Bernard had come into possession of many of the man's things that had been sealed away inside the basement that lay below our feet at that very moment. Bernard had been planning to use these things as evidence against Theodore in a court of law. I did not respond when Donovan asked me if I accepted this truth, so he went on. Bernard had found all of Theodore's old books, all his journals. Donovan told me that he himself knew that they were being kept, and he had read every word. Bernard always watched him. He didn't think Donovan should be around Ben. Donovan said he felt the old fool would have eventually killed him as he slept, all because he refused to condemn his father. Donovan asked me how he could have possibly condemned him when the man spoke so many truths. It appeared through an optical illusion that Donovan had gotten closer to me. Before, he had been standing directly in front of the coffee table. Now, he was almost 5 feet away from it. Donovan told me that Ben was delusional, that he had to be watched very carefully. Nothing he said could be believed. He saw things and heard things that were not real, and sometimes he was so convinced of these things that people around him became convinced of them as well. But Donovan assured me none of it was real. Then again, he asked me to tell him what the diary said. I reverted to a protective lie. I said I didn't remember. It was not possible for Donovan to physically hurt me. No spirit physically could. But I was deeply frightened of him all the same. Instead of paging through the diary to challenge my lie, he closed his eyes once more and lapsed into a quiet monologue, seeming to forget I was even in the room. All of us in the outside world, made him ill. He could not be expected to go on like this, with all this interference. It had begun with Bernard, who at first started claiming that it was really Donovan who killed him while he lay comatose in the hospital. He would wait until everyone was out of the room, and then accuse Donovan, telling him he'd be found out one day. And now, once in a while, there was someone like me, a stranger, who tried to get inside Ben's head, and there were more accusations. They even wanted to know about his father from time to time, and the girls they kept finding mutilated in a nearby riverbed. Tonight he had only gone to Parsonsburg, and only for an hour. Yet I had felt the need to open the door to Ben, and caused so much difficulty. A grandfather clock chimed somewhere, but there was no such clock anywhere in the house. I felt feverish and weak. My heart was thudding as it had back at the gas station. Donovan's ghost exhaled in a sickly rattle. As I watched, a deep cut on his chin produced 2 quick drops of blood. They fell to the floor and splashed silently on the carpet. He did feel better now than he had in some time, though, he told me in the dark. Maybe he could still live here, in the house. Without Ben, it was going to be much easier. After he said this, he became as inert as the paint on the wall behind his head, static and void. When I found the words to tell Donovan that I knew they were both dead and had been dead for years, he responded as a plate responds to a fork set beside it, with the changing of not a single molecule of his non-being. But after a while, he did begin to speak again, and he spoke longer than ever before. He spoke of his father's brilliance, a brilliance accumulated through those long-ago studies in the continent of Africa, and the resurrection rites he had discovered and had to fight for. It had all culminated in the sort of hand-to-hand combat his army unit might have been trained in, but for Theodore Gant, the goal had not been to take territory or defend his comrades. He had snuck into a small village under cover of darkness and butchered the 16 people who protected those valid rights whose worth was beyond imagination. Donovan's father had boiled the heads of the men and women and children he had decapitated. Donovan told me of the years it had taken to copy those rites by hand into books that would not fall apart and become dust, and of the cleverness it took to secret the books away inside this very house. The police had discovered them, of course, but Theodore Gant had written in a code known only to himself, and in the end, the police had put the books right back where they had been found. Donovan considered that honorable. He went on and on, telling me that the key that would open the tiny closet beside the basement furnace had been inside the house somewhere since 1973. He wasn't quite sure of the exact spot, but it was time to examine those rites, to go over them carefully, because he didn't want to be like he was anymore, a ghost without hands or body to do the work he had been born to do. He was thankful that I had appeared there tonight, thankful for the special channeling abilities that I held inside me. He could enter me in a whisper. When he said this, a hot marble uncoiled in my stomach like a heart attack sprung from below, and I saw that there was a danger for me in that room that I had not dared to imagine. Donovan told me that tonight was my last night on Earth, as a seeker of ghosts, as anything at all. He was coming into me now. The marble inside me leapt up, expanded and exploded like the birth of a universe. It sucked me down into a place that had no definition. I stumbled backwards as a hideous, ripping pain engulfed me. I crashed into the front foyer and towards the front door of the house. I broke my right arm with the force of my impact against the knob. The door burst open and I was outside, running, but having no way to fight off the sensation of Donovan's cruelty and hate flowing in every cell in my body. I collapsed on the front lawn, shrieking. It was snowing. Every descending flake felt like a firebrand. Then, the pain reached its plateau, something I believe no human being can ever understand. It was the pain of my soul being eaten, my body broiled with disease and rot and ghosts and the putrefacted spirit of Donovan Gant. I begged God to release me, to let me die. He did not answer me. When my colleague Xavier Dow did not receive a phone call from me at 6 a.m., he realized something had gone wrong, and he drove right away to the Markley house from Baltimore. It took him 3 hours. Upon entering, the myriad damages to the house, like the broken door, 2 upended lamps, and a deep tear in the living room carpet, told him the worst had happened. When he saw me standing at the back of the room, silhouetted by the drawn light sifting in through the wide picture windows, he was at first relieved. But when he moved closer and truly saw my face, he began to scream, and he did not stop until I tore his throat out. Then Donovan began the process of making my body search for that key that would deliver the books he had been promised by his brilliant father. Books that had been unfairly denied him by monstrous humans who never understood him. Donovan Gant is no longer a ghost. It took him less than 7 weeks to accomplish full human form through his experiments with the information those books contained, in a language few outside the forests of Africa could possibly understand. During those 7 weeks, I felt myself killing a half-dozen innocent human beings and dumping their bodies in the woods despite the disadvantage of having a badly broken arm. I lived like an animal, completely at the mercy of the parasite's will. No one ever saw the things I did. I was cursed to watch every moment that my hands committed Donovan's atrocities, and was witness to his final act of witchcraft, the one that set him utterly free and left my broken body in the cemetery in which his own had been buried years before. The long possession left me partially blind and mortally afraid of the dark. I lost almost 40 pounds of body weight, and my left ring finger was almost severed in a death struggle with one of my victims. Ironically, Donovan was so sickly brilliant that I need have no worries about the crimes I involuntarily committed ever being discovered. I am alone and safe, and my one purpose in life now is to somehow recover enough of my health to find Donovan and end his awful existence before an untold number of others have to die. But every time the sun goes down and night falls, I find my focus wandering, and instead of collecting more and more information to find Donovan, I find myself just walking the streets of the city, feeling protected by the purple shadows that conceal me. I feel some peace then, and the tortured thoughts of what I've done cannot seem to find me. It is all I can do sometimes to stop myself from actively following the shapes of people I see passing by me. I must come up with some way to keep myself from going out into the dark. I have contacted 2 colleagues, told them what happened to Dowd, and begged them to come help me through this madness. They are due to arrive tonight at the decrepit hotel I find myself living in. I pray they find Aramis Churchton, a trusted psychic researcher, and not a ghoul beyond hope. One who cannot stop himself from pursuing the strange and wondrous music I sometimes hear calling me into the shadows of the night. It is the music of death and insanity, and sometimes it sounds so beautiful that I would surely slaughter anyone who dared come between me and its mysterious promise.
Chilling tales for dark nights.